It happened one evening in a restaurant that served grilled chicken. On the table, as one would expect, stood a huge plate of chicken. A European-looking man named Hugo, a Sagittarius saint, said that Harry, the 13th awakened, was destined to die tomorrow. Harry, who was sitting opposite him, chewing chicken, asked with displeasure, "Do you really think so little of me?" The man's face was covered in scars, and he had one blind eye. The hood of his jacket was pulled over his head. Harry asked if this was because he had taken all the legs that were on the plate. A little angry, the man opposite replied that it was not like that at all. Continuing to chew his chicken, Harry said that he understood the reasons for his worries, but he had nothing to worry about and he was definitely not going to die. He chuckled and said that he had killed more misfortune bringers than all 12 constellations combined. So how could someone like him really die? Hugo just clasped his hands together tensely and stared at the table. There is a demonic tower in this world. This tower is the home of a terrible monster that can bring death to all of humanity. It all started on the last day of the 20th century, namely, when the powerful ones bringing misfortune have driven humanity into a corner with their overwhelming power. They left behind only utter darkness and chaos, and it was during this period that 12 gods appeared, calling themselves sacred beings. They vowed to give humanity the power to repel all monsters, and they chose 12 people to be granted that same indescribable power. But one day something happened that no one expected. The 13th awakened appeared, who was without the blessing of the sacred entity. Moreover, this awakened one was so powerful and so incredible, and therefore even the 12 saints were not his equal. And this awakened one was none other than Harry. Hugo and Harry reached the entrance to the demonic tower, where 12 saints were already waiting for them. Hugo thanked the man for the fact that it was thanks to him that they would be able to organize an attack on the demonic tower. Sitting down on a rock, Harry replied that words weren't enough, and that he wanted a 5-year supply of fried chicken, to which the man asked him if he wasn't tired of it yet. And then, he irritably noticed that the man continued to pronounce his last name incorrectly, to which Harry said that his last name sounded stupid. One of the saints, a girl with long blue hair, said with a smile that after defeating the red-eyed one, an incredible reward would await them, to which the man who was next to her chuckled and said that the reward would be at least $100 million, since this monster is considered the most terrible. Suddenly, Harry, covering his face with a scarf, told them that they would be better off asking for 10 years of accommodation in a 7-star hotel somewhere in Hawaii. And then he said that it would be better this way, because of the red-eyed one, many countries are on the brink of crisis. The man who had spoken earlier about the reward grinned nastily and called the boy. And then, with the same smirk, he asked him if he shouldn't raise his standards if he wanted to work with them, and if he didn't want to heal his disfigured face and body. Looking at their backs, Harry thought that they were not saints at all, just a bunch of scum who only cared about their own gain. Suddenly, the two turned around and addressed the guy again, laughing nastily. The man told the guy to stop rushing to help everyone he came across, because only a few victims would recoup that price. The guy sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to go, and he thought to himself how good it was that he would never see them again after finishing this matter. The saints entered the cave. Long stalagmites hung from the ceiling, and everything around was illuminated by a warm glow. The saints stopped and looked up in amazement. They looked at something so big that they had to look up. As it turned out, they were already in front of the Lord of the Demonic Tower, next to whom they all seemed like small flies. Harry thought that just one look at the Lord made him feel a terrifying pressure. Suddenly the ruler opened his mouth, from which something lit up, and his gaze did not leave the people who came to him. Everything around the cave shook violently, and the saints began to look around. The ground, unable to withstand the pressure, began to crack. The pressure was so strong that Harry put his hands in front of him to protect himself as he was swept backwards. The stone in front of the ruler's throne cracked, and a bright light burst out from the cracks. And then a huge glowing column broke through the floor, rising upward. This pillar of light lifted up all the saints who were within its area of effect. A pillar of light burst from the roof of the castle, and everything around was illuminated. Soon the light faded, and everything around was filled with smoke. The frightened saints, who missed this pillar of light, huddled against the castle walls. At their feet was a cliff beneath which lay a whole lake of lava. The throne of the ruler remained untouched. Only the smoke from this blow hid it. The Lord raised his head smugly, looking around, a wide smile on his face. The saintly girl had already recovered a little from this action, but her body continued to tremble slightly, and she could only quietly say that they needed to run. And then she screamed, and all 3 saints who were still alive immediately ran back. Harry remained standing where he was, turning to them. He quietly said that he couldn't believe that these bags of shit were called saints. He gripped the handle of his weapon tighter, thinking that it didn't matter to him anyway. After all, he will be the one who kicks this red-eyed guy's ass. And then he, breaking the earth, instantly rushed forward. With a sharp movement, he jumped up and found himself right at the level of the monster's forehead. The guy swung his weapon to strike. After some time, Harry continued to strike. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he didn't stop killing monsters. His eyes glowed with a terrifying blue light, and there was a dagger in his teeth. Only one thought was playing in his head. I must cut up monsters. In the shadow of the cave, a multitude of red eyes appeared, different in shape and size. A huge number of monsters appeared in front of Harry, who was no longer wearing his jacket, and he thought that this was a special trap in which more and more hordes of monsters were constantly appearing. Harry no longer had his left arm. His body was covered in scars, but his eyes continued to sparkle with a cold blue light. Clenching his jaw even tighter, causing his gums to bleed, he wondered if they all thought he would give in so easily. There was a mad light in his eyes as he promised himself and all the saints that he would survive and tear them all to shreds. Time moved inexorably forward, and now 20 years have passed since that moment. Harry was approaching another monster, who exclaimed that this could not be. He asked the man how he got there, to which Harry replied that he was the last one left. The monster pressed himself even harder against the stone and screamed in panic, begging for help. Harry raised his foot to step on the monster. A long beard had already appeared on his face, and he said that it was already over. Then he crushed the monster's head with his foot, sending blood spraying into the air. Standing in front of the last monster's corpse, Harry sighed heavily and tiredly. Looking up at the sky, he noted that it was finally over. But suddenly everything around shook, causing stones to fall from somewhere above. The man weakened and began to fall to the ground, weakly saying that he would finally be able to get out of here, while everything around him continued to shake. And then he fell to the ground and the stones buried his body. After some time, it was already daytime outside. The city's high-rise buildings had long since been destroyed, and the air was brown from dust and dirt. The guy running next to the older man said that he had said that this was not the best way to go, to which the man replied that he had not known that things would turn out this way, and that he had said that today was safer than usual. And as it turned out, several high-ranking monsters were chasing them. The guy, with tears in his eyes, exclaimed that everything was bad. And yet the fortune teller told him that today he would meet a monster with whom he should not associate himself. One of the monsters suddenly pushed off the ground and jumped, and then he landed right between the boy and the man. The guy fell to the ground and, in anger, he hit the ground with his fist. As it turned out, they were now surrounded by these monsters and therefore could do nothing. As he rose to his feet, the boy thought that if only Master Harry could return from the demonic tower, those damn monsters would not dare to appear here. And suddenly the gates of the demonic tower swung open. The boy and the man stared at this in surprise. And then there was an explosion. Trying to shield themselves from the gusts of wind, the boy and the man put their hands in front of them. And, as it turned out, part of the land was simply destroyed, causing a circle to form on the earth. The boy and the man were buried under rubble, and the second asked what it was. Suddenly he called out to the boy, calling him Charlie, and said that someone was coming out of the ruined tower. And indeed, someone came out of the tower, and his strong hand appeared with veins bulging on it. Amidst this devastated area stood a lone figure. This someone clenched his hands, cracking his fingers, and sighed with relief. Dark lightning bolts appeared from his body, and the man cried out that these bastards had struck him in the back and left him to rot in this hole. He suddenly thrust his hand forward and shouted that they were now in complete shit. He then delivered a blow to the jaw of one of the high-ranking monsters, and he pinned another one to the ground with his foot. The man, who was still under the rubble, said that he couldn't believe that someone could easily deal with orange-class monsters. The man continued to beat the monsters, and a whole mountain of them accumulated under his feet. Then he got distracted, and then he suddenly jumped up, causing a column of dust to rise into the air. And then with one foot he smashed the debris under which Charlie and the man were, and they recoiled in fear. Falling to the ground, Charlie asked the man why he decided to attack them, to which the man merely said that it looked like his work here was done, and the others breathed a sigh of relief. And then Charlie asked his friend if this wasn't a real sensation, since some person was able to get out of the tower, to which he replied that this couldn't be, and he just happened to be nearby. Suddenly, a shadow fell on the place where they were still sitting on the ground. It turned out to be a huge wolf, its eyes glowing red and drooling from its mouth. The men sitting on the ground screamed in fear that it was the leader of the pack. And then one of them shouted at the man that he advised him to run away from there. The monster's eyes glowed even brighter, and red lightning bolts erupted from its body. And then he opened his mouth, from which a beam of red light burst out. The men cowered in fear, pressing their hands to their heads. This beam of light illuminated the space in front of the monster, destroying everything around. The explosion was so powerful that it could be seen several kilometers away. Soon the light went out and everything became quiet. Charlie and his friend were surprised to notice that they were still alive. Opening their eyes, they noticed in front of them only the broad back of a strange stranger, who stood in a relaxed pose. Looking around, they noticed that the earth had been destroyed by that beam, but they did not feel the impact because there was a man standing in front of them. Charlie's friend thought that perhaps this stranger had protected them. And then the stranger took off and jumped high into the sky, causing everyone else to look up. The man raised his hand to strike the huge dog. With one powerful blow, he smashed the beast's head into the ground. Charlie and his friend were quite surprised by this. The stranger landed on the ground with a grin on his face, and then he turned proudly to the men, while the corpse of the monster lay behind him. He said that he was definitely finished now, but he himself noted with displeasure that it stunk in here. And then his gaze moved somewhere to the side, and he quietly muttered something. He turned to the men standing behind him, causing them to flinch in fear. The man began to turn towards them to say something, his whole body emitting some kind of unkind green light. The men shook with fear, trying to understand what he wanted to tell them. But the stranger only smiled good-naturedly and asked them to buy him some food. He scratched his head awkwardly while the men just fell silent, stunned. And then he added that clothes wouldn't hurt either. After some time, the stranger and the two men reached a small cafe. The man put the now empty plate on the table with a sharp movement. Charlie's friend glanced at the check and, noticing the cost of the meal, practically gave up the ghost. And then they indignantly asked the stranger how he managed to eat food worth a whole $1,000, to which he replied, "But you said that you didn't have that much money, and that's why I ordered only a little." He then turned around to order another helping and noticed that they themselves had said they were willing to pay for his dinner for saving their lives. To which Charlie's friend shouted indignantly. Charlie, covering his ears, asked the stranger who he was and why he was near the tower. The man, chewing on a toothpick, replied that he had been inside the tower and then simply walked out of it, to which surprised exclamations were immediately heard. And the man said that he had one more question. He asked them who they were, because they looked like ordinary townspeople, but they emanated a magical aura. Charlie's friend replied that it was because the guy was a Templar, and then he asked him if he himself was a Templar. Picking up his spoon from the table, the stranger replied that he had no need to wag his tail in front of some bigwig. But suddenly, something surprised him. He looked at his reflection in the spoon, and suddenly his face became distorted as if from fear, and cold sweat ran down his face. He slammed his hands on the table, stood up with a sharp movement, and exclaimed that he urgently needed a mirror, to which the waitress quietly pointed it out to him. Approaching the mirror, the man began to take off the clothes he had received. He stared at the mirror in shock, his hand almost touching his face. He noted that his body was completely healed. Harry thought that his old wounds were so terrible that there was no point in even trying to heal them. And then he came to his senses and noticed that his left hand was also in place. He looked at his palm, which now had some kind of round mark on it. When the man looked at it, the sign began to appear, and a snake became clearly visible on his palm. Suddenly, Harry felt a strong pain in his arm, causing him to grab it tightly. The veins on his arms bulged. The guy's body began to emit green light, and the outline of a snake appeared behind his back. The man closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he was no longer in the cafe. His whole body seemed to have turned into a disembodied spirit. In front of him was a huge snake, which looked at him with its red eye. The man looked tiny compared to the snake, and the snake released its thin tongue. Harry reached out to touch her. When he did this, a bright light shone from the place where they touched, and then everything around lit up with a bright yellow light. The next moment, Harry woke up sitting on the floor of the cafe with his hand extended in front of him. Charlie extended his hand to help the man up and asked him if he was okay. Harry waved his hands and asked if they had seen a huge snake, to which they only stared at him. Charlie said they didn't see any snake. They just saw him suddenly take off his clothes and run to the mirror, and then start screaming while clutching his wrist. Looking at his palm again, the man concluded that it seemed like no one could see it except him. And then the man felt something behind him. As it turned out, these were some tablets with text that said that he had survived death, and now he had become the owner of the constellation Ophiuchus, as well as a description of his abilities. One of his skills was super regeneration, and Harry thought that he had never heard of other saints seeing anything like that before. Moreover, he does not sense the energy of sacred beings. However, be that as it may, he was satisfied with this arrangement, since his body had fully recovered. Now he needed to track down the traitors who had left him to die, and especially the one who had stabbed him in the back. Harry, thinking about this, tensed his hand, causing his veins to bulge, and he said that this whole body begins to tremble just from the thought of revenge. And Charlie and his friend, noticing the strange behavior of the man, shook with fear. At the same time, somewhere in the place where the incident took place, police tape was already hanging. The man standing nearby said that the demonic tower, considered an indestructible fortress, had suddenly collapsed, to which another replied that this news would soon set the whole world on its ears. The first one said that this place has a special connection with Harry. Could this be the work of his followers or other saints? The second man replied that it was interesting, and then he told the other to look at the one who was pulling. He said that this was a monster that was difficult for even high-ranking saints to deal with. Who else could challenge such a monster and destroy the tower? Then the first man asked if Harry had really gotten out of the tower alive. Another told him that they couldn't be sure of that. They could only wait until new clues appeared. At the same time, something was happening in one of the city's multi-story buildings. There were many cameras in one of the rooms of this building. The reporters approached Victor and asked him how he could comment on the destruction of the demonic tower, and whether it was possible that Harry had returned alive. Victor, who was the holy sign of Ares, stood on the stage and did not answer. Taking the microphone, he said he had no comment on the matter. And then he and his bodyguards left the room while reporters shouted after him wanting answers. An expensive car was driving along the road at great speed. Victor, who was sitting in it, hit the armrest with force, breaking his glasses. He grimaced and exclaimed that he had heard Harry's name so many times today. He wondered if he had really been alive all this time in the demonic tower, all 20 years. Putting his hand into his vest, he thought that this couldn't be true, because there were thousands of deadly creatures there, and all of them were black class. He took his pipe out of his pocket, thinking that it was a miracle that they had managed to escape from there, having stolen the red-eyed man's throat, and there was no way the man could have survived there. As he bit his pipe, he thought about how Harry's body was on edge due to the monster's deadly attacks, and he didn't even wear armor like all the other saints. He frowned, thinking that perhaps he really was still alive. Thinking about this, he exhaled a huge cloud of smoke, and then, clenching his jaws, he hissed that then it would be the end of them all. Meanwhile, Harry took Charlie's phone and said that he should start with this bastard. Meanwhile, a plane arrived at one of the airports, and only one person came out of it, who was greeted loudly. The bodyguards exclaimed that it was an honor for them to meet one of the 12 saints. As it turned out, the one who arrived on that plane was Hugo, the holy sign of Sagittarius. Descending to the ground, he asked the still bowing men where the Prime Minister was, and they replied that he was waiting in his office and that transport was ready. Hugo immediately headed towards the car, and the bodyguards bowed even lower. One of them, looking after the man, remarked with admiration how majestic he was. He said that this is exactly what a truly chosen person should look like. The car drove quickly along the road. Hugo sat silently on the seat, his legs crossed, and looked out the window. Suddenly his phone vibrated. Somewhat annoyed, he thought that it must be those annoying reporters again, and he couldn't believe that rumors about Harry's return had become so popular. He angrily turned the phone face down and exclaimed that 20 years had already passed, and his phone finally went silent. Frowning, the man stared out the window again. He remembered his words to him 20 years ago about Harry being destined to die tomorrow. As Harry replied, he had no idea that he had such a low opinion of him. Thinking about how when they attacked the demonic tower, at Harry's request, he went outside and held back the incoming hordes of monsters. He wanted to believe that his premonition was deceiving him, and that Harry would be able to get out alive. That day, after leaving the cave and meeting with the other saints, the wounded Hugo asked them why Harry was not with them. And then it turned out that the saints who had entered Harry together had abandoned him and returned with the head of the red-eyed man. This event became known to the whole world. 20 saints, including himself, were recognized as heroes and gained even greater influence. Hugo, unable to believe that Harry was dead, asked again and again to begin searching for him. But Jean-Louis, the holy sign of the dark cancer, answered him with a grin that it was time for him to stop. He said that he knew perfectly well about the number of monsters in the demonic tower, so there was no chance that Harry survived. With an even more disgusting grin, the man said that if Hugo was so worried about Harry, he could go looking for him alone. No one would stop him. But then the list of saints would be reduced to 11. Hugo didn't respond to this. He only clenched his jaws tightly, grinding his teeth in anger. Thinking about this, the man's mood worsened, and he unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. Looking out the window, he thought that no matter how strong Harry was, he couldn't survive. And besides, too much time had passed. Suddenly, the driver announced that the Prime Minister was calling him. The man took the call and the Prime Minister asked him if he could talk, to which he replied that he could, and asked what the matter was. The Prime Minister asked him if he had heard the news yet, and then said that it seemed the demonic tower had been destroyed. Hugo clutched his head and sighed wearily, wondering if this story was happening again. And then he said that if the man wanted to ask him to start looking for Harry, then he would have to refuse. Frowning, she said that the man died that day, and this incident with the tower was most likely a setup by his fans. And then he told the Prime Minister not to even hope to get more votes with this, to which he replied that this was not at all the case. He said that if the report that had just been transmitted to the South Korean government was accurate, then a call had been made to that number quite recently. Not understanding what was going on, Hugo asked what kind of challenge this was. The Prime Minister replied that the call had been made to Harry's personal phone number, causing Hugo to shudder all over. He pounded his fists convulsively on the back of the chair and exclaimed, asking if it was true. And then, in a panic, he ordered the driver to stop the car. The wheels stopped abruptly, raising dust from the road. Reaching for the phone, Hugo thought that it might have been Harry calling him then. Looking at the screen, he saw that it said that he already had 39 missed calls and a voice message sent. The man stared at his phone screen with his mouth wide open. He tapped the phone screen to call the number that had called him recently. He sat tensely in his chair as the phone continued to ring. Suddenly, the call was answered and a voice came from the receiver calling the man by the nickname Harry had called him. And then Harry told him in English that he would find him and kill him. And then he joyfully said goodbye to him. Hugo's mouth was wide open when he heard that voice. He realized that that manner of speech was so similar to Harry. Could he really be alive? And then he screamed, ordering the driver to return to the airport. Meanwhile, Harry was still sitting in the same cafe. He looked at the phone screen with a menacing grin and said that Hugo had grown up and now even dared to ignore his calls. Charlie asked him who he was calling so persistently, to which Harry simply replied that it didn't matter. And then he said that this smartphone, as the guy called it, is just an amazing thing. Harry said that he entered the tower in 2005, and now in 2025 the world has become a much better place, to which Charlie asked him if this was the first time he used a smartphone. And then he said that with it he can connect to the internet and even follow the news. The man peeked out from behind his smartphone and asked if he could then watch the news about Harry. Charlie, pointing to his phone screen, replied that of course, since it was the hottest topic of discussion right now. And immediately, a multitude of different news and posts about Harry appeared on the phone screen. However, all the comments were negative, some were afraid of Harry, others didn't value him and called him a loser. The man, reading this, got angry and squeezed the phone too hard, causing Charlie to scream in fear. Grinding his teeth, Harry exclaimed, asking who saved them from the red-eyed man, and yet these saints did nothing for them, and they praised them. He exhaled, calmed down, and said that he should just ignore it, which was kind of sweet. Looking again at the phone screen, he saw the news about the revision of the will that Harry left. He decided to give all his fortune to orphanages and educational institutions in the event of his death. Remembering this, he smiled faintly and said that he hoped that all the money reached the recipients. And then he pointed to the screen to see the news. But, as it turned out, the news said that Harry left all his property, including relics, to the saints, in the hope that they would use them wisely for the benefit of the whole world. The man got angry again, but with even greater force, causing him to squeeze the phone so hard that it shattered into small pieces, and he screamed that he would definitely strip them of their pathetic skins. Charlie fell to the floor next to the remains of his phone, a stingy tear running down his cheek as he said goodbye to the phone. Sitting back down at the table, Harry thought about what he should do. He thought about warning them about his return, but his appearance was very different from what it was 20 years ago. And even if he went out into the street and started shouting that he was that same Harry, no one would believe him. Therefore, he should torture each of the 12 saints separately, and he should go to the bottom for some time. Suddenly, he felt something approaching him from behind. A message appeared warning him that he was being watched, and Harry noted that he recognized the aura. He decided to leave the cafe, and, noticing him, Charlie asked him where he was going, to which the man replied that he was going to get some fresh air. After leaving the room, he stopped on the street, and looking up at the sky, he was able to notice many spirits of some kind. As it turned out, these were avatars in the form of rams. Upon noticing them, Harry immediately realized that these were animals of the holy sign of the White Aries. There have been reports that these avatars have recreated the barrier in the name of the White Aries, and therefore the influence of other constellations has been neutralized and the avatars demand tribute. Clenching his fist, the irritated man said that even if they were sucking up to the sacred entities, who were they even thinking of commanding? However, then he heard someone calling his name, which made him turn around, still irritated. It turned out that it was just a couple of people, and the man said that everyone was just talking about this Harry, and the noise from this chatter would soon finish him off. The woman who was walking next to him, holding his hand, replied that she was talking about the same thing, and that this stupidity was being reported on all the news. The man, lighting a cigarette, said with a grin that, although the man's name was not tarnished, he was amazed that everyone had suddenly started showing interest in him. On the man's cardigan, a golden badge with the sign of the Gemini constellation glittered. Charlie, who followed Harry out, noticed this and realized that these people were from the Twins constellation squad. Frowning, the man from the Gemini constellation squad noticed someone standing in his way. Charlie shouted at Harry to come back quickly and not to provoke these people. However, Harry didn't seem to hear him and continued to stand in place. The irritated man asked Harry what he was staring at and then ordered him to get out of there. Charlie and his friend, seeing this, became completely dejected and thought that they were finished. The man standing in front of Harry raised his hand to inhale more smoke from his cigarette. And then he blew all this smoke straight into the man's face, standing practically right next to him. Noticing the displeasure on the man's face, the Gemini constellation member asked him if there were any problems. And then he leaned his forehead against him and defiantly told him to hit him if he had any problems. The woman who was with the man immediately told him to calm down. Otherwise, this guy was going to shit his pants. And then the couple started walking past, calling him a coward. They started to drift further and further apart, and the man said that all these idiots who were fanatics about Harry were no different from each other, and the woman supported him. And then she asked why this weakest saint was so popular with everyone, and whether the very act of canonizing him as a saint was absurd in itself, and these questions seemed to pierce the man's head. Charlie ran over to calm Harry down and told him that he had behaved well, and that it was good that he had not provoked the representatives of the Gemini constellation. However, the next second, Harry turned to the departing couple and shouted at them, calling them cockroaches. The couple turned around incredulously and asked again if he was talking to them. Completely furious, Harry replied that he was talking to them, and then he cracked his fists. The man from the Gemini constellation squad immediately turned around and walked back quickly. He stood face to face with Harry, pressing his forehead against his, and asked him irritably what he had just said. And then he started talking about how he was just a pathetic simpleton, from whom there wasn't even a magical aura, but suddenly someone's hand rose above his head. Harry quickly flicked his finger to the man's forehead, sending him flying. He slammed into the wall of the house with a sharp movement, raising dust, and his woman screamed. Charlie and his friend froze in panic as they watched this. Harry stood there with a smug grin, his t-shirt blowing in the wind and his fingers still steaming. The woman decided that she could not stay away, and so she decided to use her ability, causing her body to turn into white light. A second later, she was behind Harry, but he immediately noticed her, asking her if she really thought he wouldn't notice her. And then with another click, he sent the woman flying, causing her to crash into the wall of another building. Touching his face with his hand, he quietly called these people losers. Charlie's friend exclaimed that using magic in the middle of the street was strictly prohibited, to which Harry replied that if he had used magic, there wouldn't have been a single spot left of those losers. To which Charlie and the man were surprised to think that Harry had knocked out 2 A-rank Templars with just brute force. Harry suddenly noticed something and lowered his head a little, and then he crouched down to get closer to the man he had knocked out. He carefully picked up the medallion that hung around the man's neck, and then with one sharp movement he tore it off. And then he said that this is exactly what he felt when he hit the man, and he asked if it was a relic. Having examined the medallion more closely, he asked where these people had obtained the relic, since only saints should have them. In response, Charlie asked the man if he really knew absolutely nothing, and then he said that several decades ago, humanity was practically wiped out. But thanks to sacred beings and the constellations they chose, people managed to survive this disaster. However, just 12 people would not be able to protect this entire vast world, and so they decided that they needed to start gathering followers, which today are called branches. Those who were granted a portion of the power of the saints began to be called Templars. Such people began to be divided into ranks according to their level of power. First saints, then cardinals, then bishops, and finally Templars. The Templars' main source of strength is their faith, which is why there is intense competition between branches and the attraction of new followers. Thus, the chosen Templars receive relics from sacred entities from time to time. Hearing this, Harry thought that things had changed a lot in 20 years. But suddenly the guy pointed something out to him. As it turned out, the avatars that had previously been simply hanging in the air were now all gathered around the man. There have been reports that the avatars of wealth and greed associated with the White Aries constellation are enjoying this situation, demanding that the man quickly deal with the couple, and for this, they promise a worthy reward. Charlie's friend, with his mouth wide open, told him that Harry had attracted the attention of the avatars. These avatars were like reflections of the sacred beings themselves, and standing in their way was like challenging the gods themselves. The man exclaimed that they should hurry up and do as they asked, but Harry only laughed. He snapped his fists again and said that now he understood why he had felt that the stinking aura of Aries was so present, and that it turned out that they intended to fill their bellies, just like that pig. Harry put his hands in his pockets and stepped forward, saying that in the end, nothing had changed. He kicked the ground hard, causing the stone to crack, and everything around began to fill with Harry's turquoise aura. This aura began to attack the Aries avatars, causing them to make sounds of pain. A bright light illuminated everything around, causing Charlie and his friend to cover their eyes with their hands. And then the avatar barrier began to slowly disappear. And soon, there was almost nothing left of it. And Harry said that they were showing off no matter what, even though they were worthless losers. Charlie looked around in surprise, not believing that the White Aries constellation had retreated. Looking at Harry again, he thought that this man was not an ordinary person. Harry called Charlie by name, and he immediately rushed to respond. And then he asked the guy again whether he had said that this couple belonged to the branching of twins. The guy replied that this was true, and in their country the twin branch had the greatest influence. It was an elite group that had gathered 2/3 of all the major corporations. Then Harry asked if that meant they had a lot of money. He grinned menacingly and asked that then the clothes they wore must be expensive too. The man again lowered himself to the other man and began to take off his clothes, saying that it was time for him to make some good money. After some time, all three reached some house. Pointing his finger at one of the windows, Charlie said that he lived on the second floor, and his friend said that his door was right next door. Charlie bowed to Harry and thanked him for saving their lives and even walking them home. However, there was no response, so the boy carefully opened one eye. Yawning, Harry asked them if they were going inside, as he was already sleepy and had clothes in his hands, while Charlie thought indignantly that this guy had decided to spend the night with them. But the guy still let the man into the house, and he quickly took off his clothes, and strands of black hair flew onto the floor. Harry, now with his hair cut short, stood in front of the mirror with his hands on his hips, and then he looked at himself in the mirror and grinned. Charlie, seeing his new look, raised his finger up and said admiringly that the short haircut suited him very well. He exclaimed that the man looked even cooler now, causing Harry to become a little embarrassed and look away. He smirked as he thought about how in the past, due to the side effects of his abilities, he treasured every hair, but who knew that now he would be fine with it. But then he heard some sound and frowned. As it turned out, it was a mosquito, and the man asked what this attractant had forgotten in the apartment. With a sharp movement, he grabbed it and squeezed it tightly. When he released his hand, the remains of the attractant fell to the floor, and Charlie raised another finger and said that even experts couldn't do this. And then he began to catch even more enticing ones. He asked why they were so attracted to him, to which the guy replied that perhaps they were attracted by his smell. But Harry, looking around, said that this usually happens when something is wrong with the house. His gaze caught on a shelf that was filled with all sorts of things, and he said that now it was clear why these creatures flocked here, and who would keep such abominations in the house anyway. Charlie said that all these things were received from the twin constellation personally. The guy said that these artifacts did not belong to him, but the saint blessed them. But suddenly something cut the statuette. The boy fell to the shards in panic, and Harry looked at his hand with disgust. Then he took the mask in his hands and said that this thing is intended for surveillance of the buyer. Continuing to rummage through the boxes, he threw out all the artifacts, simultaneously reporting what they did, and their effect was bad. The man asked if these saints had not only appropriated his property, but had also started selling such disgusting goods. The man became very angry and said irritably that the very thought made him furious. He shouted loudly for the guy to throw it all away, and at that time someone was standing outside the door and heard all these shouts. Charlie was hopelessly trying to take at least one artifact from the man when suddenly the door opened, and a red-haired guy appeared on the threshold of the apartment. Harry asked who this guy was, and Charlie started to break out in a cold sweat and quietly called the guy's name, calling him Scott. Scott's face darkened and he asked again who he was. And then he himself answered that he was the owner of this apartment, and suddenly his blue aura burst out. Hearing this, the man immediately calmed down, and the entire apartment was in chaos with broken artifacts. Meanwhile, Victor was already at his residence. He, in shock, asked again about the Korean avatars having disappeared. The subordinate, who was kneeling in front of the stairs, replied that this was indeed the case, and that it had caused a great deal of fuss in Korea. Gritting his teeth, Victor wondered who could have done something like this. He thought that avatars were direct representatives of sacred entities, and therefore only someone unusually strong could disperse them. The man told his subordinate to contact the other saints and ask them if she had anything to do with this. The subordinate replied that he understood, but the shooter had not been in touch for a long time, to which the man replied that this was not a cause for concern, since Hugo had warned that he was going to get a new position in the UK. Then, the subordinate said that they were informed that upon arrival at the UK airport, he immediately transferred to another flight. This made Victor turn around and he asked where the man was going, to which he was told that Hugo had gone to South Korea. Victor thought, rubbing his chin with his hand. He thought that Hugo was on good terms with Harry. So could his actions be connected to tears for the return of that bastard? Could it be that he actually survived? The man cursed quietly and grabbed the candelabra. And then he shouted that this was all ridiculous nonsense and threw the candelabra at the floor, which his subordinate barely managed to dodge. Victor cried out for him to report to him more clearly, and then he asked about what else was there. The man replied that an unconscious Templar of the branch was found at the place where the avatars disappeared. He was lying in the middle of the street wearing only his underwear. And also, according to witnesses, before this he had entered into a fight with a handsome young man. Victor latched onto the word handsome, and then he assumed that it couldn't be Harry, since his face was covered in scars. He thought that things weren't going too well anyway, and it was quite possible that he had managed to get out alive. For some unknown reason, the Korean avatars disappeared, and what's worse, they failed to kill the Spider Queen. Victor clenched his fist tightly, thinking that at this rate his position could be in jeopardy. And then he ordered that his plane be prepared, to which his subordinate raised his head and asked him if he was really going to go there personally. The man answered in the affirmative and said that he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. He grabbed a coat that was lying nearby and waved it, throwing it over his shoulders. He frowned and said that he absolutely had to see for himself all this hell that was going on in Korea, and he walked forward, lighting a cigar. Meanwhile, the member of the twin branching was taken to the twin branching hospital in Korea. The man lay on the bed with sensors attached to his chest, and on his face he had a breathing mask. An old man approached the man's bed. His hair was gray and his head was almost bald. His face had age spots on it. The old man exclaimed, asking who dared to harm his grandson. When no one answered him, he turned to the man standing against the wall, and the man said that there was no need to worry so much. The man replied that the saint of the Gemini constellation had sent him specifically to sort this out. This man's name was Mike. He was a Templar of the S class of the Gemini branch. Meanwhile, Harry and Charlie told Scott everything, and he asked again whether they had really met at the demonic tower. He continued asking about the events, clearly not believing it, and Charlie just nodded in panic, sweat running down his face. Scott screamed at him to stop lying to him, and besides, the man had destroyed all of his artifacts, to which Harry said they were fakes anyway. The guy asked the man what branch he was from, to which the man asked him if he really thought he needed something like that. Then an irritated Scott asked what god he believed in then, to which Harry replied that he didn't need those 12 idiots. The guy asked his rank, to which he also did not receive a normal answer, so he decided to ask what his name was. The man, also irritated, replied that his name was Harry. Scott could no longer stand this irritation, and Charlie hastened to calm him down. The boy's blue aura swirled around him, and he said that the man had broken into someone else's house without permission and destroyed all the relics. The light from the aura became even brighter, and a figure appeared above his head as he exclaimed that this bastard still dared to call himself by the name of the Great Harry. Charlie called Scott again, yelling at him not to destroy their apartment. An alert went out that a magical outburst from the twins' follower had been detected, and Harry said it looked like the tough guy was determined to destroy the house. The man then activated one of his new skills, God's Gaze. Then, information appeared that Scott was a follower of the A-rank twins. His nickname was Crushing Blow. Information appeared about his skills and personal traits, and the most important was his trait, Genius, thanks to which the effective training was 200%. Harry thought that at such a young age the boy already possessed high-level skills. The Genius trait was clearly not just a coincidence. A figure appeared above the boy's head and screamed loudly, causing his eyes to glow blue. Trying to defend himself, Charlie shouted at the man to run as quickly as possible, because Scott was a high-ranking Templar and also a crazy fan of Harry. Scott then asked the guy if he was crazy and then told him to get out of his way if he didn't want to get swatted. But the man suddenly appeared behind him with a smirk on his face and said that the guy was playing with fire so furiously that he risked peeing his pants. Hearing his voice behind him, the guy immediately hurried to turn around. But when he did, the man immediately sent him flying with his flick. Scott fell to the floor, his blue aura fading. And the man said that at this rate, this idiot would have burned down not only his own apartment, but the entire house. Charlie panicked and asked if he was okay, to which Harry replied with a grin that everything was great. However, this did not completely convince the guy, and he looked at his friend uncertainly. Meanwhile, Scott lay unconscious on the floor, with a huge bump on his forehead and foam coming out of his mouth. Harry went to his room to take a nap, and Charlie began to slow down Scott to wake him up. The man entered one of the rooms and slowly closed the door. And then he was dumbfounded and stopped at the door, looking around the room. The entire table was covered with hairy figurines. The man, his face darkened, asked what it was. To which Charlie replied that he had said that Scott was obsessed with Harry, and the now-awake boy asked him to be careful with the figurines. But the man immediately broke one of them, saying that they irritated him, and therefore he needed to at least tear off the head. Charlie tried to drag his friend out the door while he screamed at the man that he was a fucking psycho, to which the man replied that he was Harry, not a fucking psycho. Scott screamed hysterically, tears streaming from his eyes and snot running from his nose, his face twisted in pain. Meanwhile, someone was sitting in one of the cafes in Korea. News reports indicated that yesterday afternoon, 2 members of the twin lineage were attacked by a man, whose identity has not yet been established, with the stated goal of stealing items. Hugo, who was sitting at the table, covered his face with his hand, thinking that this was definitely Harry's doing. And what was he thinking? The waitress approached the man and, with a smile on her face, asked him if he was ready to order. But the man irritably told her that Victor should shut up this clown show and get out of here. Victor, in the waitress's body, replied with a grin that he had figured it out too quickly, and therefore it was not interesting. And then he said that he hadn't been able to contact him for a long time, and therefore was glad to see him. He leaned on the man's shoulder and said that, judging by his hasty arrival in Korea, he came here because of Harry, and therefore he should tell him everything. Hugo snapped his fingers and said that this is exactly why he hates this pervert who steals people's bodies. The girl's body jerked in response, and she came to her senses. And then she asked, confused, what she had just done. Slamming his fist on the table, the man thought about how he needed to get to Harry as quickly as possible. The next day, Charlie and Scott went to the hypermarket. Charlie asked his friend if the man could really be Harry, to which he replied that he looked completely different. And then he shouted that Harry was also a hero of humanity. He couldn't be such a redneck, to which the guy replied that he had definitely seen him leaving the demonic tower, and that his strength was amazing. But Scott only confidently replied once again that this couldn't be, because his father had told him so, and then he hastened to hush up the subject. Suddenly someone shouted that there was a thief here, and the guys stopped, looking around. And then something suddenly knocked them down and turned over their cart. As it turned out, it was that same thief. Falling to the floor, Charlie noticed that he was very fast, which meant that he was from the Scorpio branch, and his friend said that he was wasting his strength on bad deeds. The thief began to rush quickly from side to side, stealing everything he could. The thief thought that these pathetic Templars could never catch up with him. He clenched his teeth, thinking that he had already made enough money, and therefore it was time for him to go. But before he could do so, someone hit him in the stomach, stopping him. The blow caused the man's eyes to open wide and turn red, and drool began to flow from his mouth. It turned out it was Harry, and Charlie asked him what he was doing there, to which he replied that he forgot to tell them to buy some chicken. Then someone told the man that he was very good, since he was able to catch a member of the Scorpion branch, considering their speed. It turned out it was Mike, and he said that the man was just an ordinary follower, and therefore, it would be better to call the police next time. Harry looked at the man and wondered what kind of man he was. But the next moment, everything behind them shook, which made the men turn away from each other. The others in the hypermarket were also scared by this shaking. The thief, who had already come to his senses, thought that this was an excellent chance for him to escape, and then he quickly rushed forward towards the doors. He thought that he could have been caught because of this strange man, but the earthquake came in handy. But suddenly he noticed that the floor in front of him began to crack. He managed to stop, and the next moment a huge monster in the form of a centipede jumped out of the ground. The thief raised his head and asked why the attractant appeared in the green zone. He took a step back, thinking that he needed to get out of here before it was too late. And then he jumped high into the air. The man grinned and thought that even though this creature was strong, there was no way it could catch up with him. But at that very moment, a monster's wide-open mouth appeared at the man's side, causing the man's face to freeze. The monster devoured the man, and then he sank to the ground, and the crowd could only watch. And, as it turned out, there was someone sitting on the monster's back. The Spider Queen looked coldly at the crowd below with her red eyes. A message came over the loudspeakers that an emergency had occurred. A misfortune bringer had appeared in the hypermarket, and everyone needed to return to the building immediately. Meanwhile, the monster rushed at the crowd, which was running away in panic to return to the building, and a voice announced that due to the invasion of the Spider Queen, this zone was turning red. The alarm was still sounding, people were panicking and trying to escape, and one little boy stopped in the middle of the road crying loudly. The monster's mouth opened wide, and it was about to devour this easy prey. But before that happened, Harry landed on the monster's head. The boy froze, looking at his savior, his body trembling slightly, and Harry told him that he should be more careful. The man extended his hand to him with a smile on his face, his eyes shining with a turquoise light, and he asked if he was hurt. But the next moment the boy rushed forward, running away from his savior. The man cleared his throat awkwardly and said that the boy seemed to be okay. Rising to his feet, he asked what this giant was doing here. The monsters began to pounce on the man, and then a turquoise snake began to form next to him. The snake's head appeared next to him, and the man asked about how today he would be able to have fun for the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, the black car was driving quickly along the road. Victor, who was sitting in this car, asked his subordinate to repeat it. The subordinate said again that the creatures that brought misfortune appeared in the middle of the hypermarket, to which the man asked him to repeat the name of that creature to him. Then he said that they were informed that it was the Spider Queen. Hearing this again, Victor thought about how they had failed during the raid, and he had barely managed to put the seal. Had she already escaped? Clenching his fist, he thought that there was no way he could defeat the red-class monster on his own. After the advent of the misfortune-inducing wallpapers, locations began to be divided into 6 classes according to the level of danger, with the blue zone being a blessed abode. Green zone is a safe zone. The yellow zone is a zone of slight danger. The orange zone is a zone of monsters that pose a great threat to life. And the red zone is the zone where deadly monsters have gathered. The black zone is an area where life is impossible. Since the Spider Queen has appeared in hypermarkets, this is now a red zone. Victor's driver asked him what they should do now. After a short silence, the man replied that they needed to seal everything. He thought that no one should know anything. If the public knew about the failure of the last raid, they would lose their reputation. In a slight panic, Victor told her subordinate to tell them that they could no longer save those inside, and to send the Templars to completely seal off the building. Meanwhile, some gurgling sounds continued to be heard in the hypermarket. The monsters continued to advance in numerous hordes. Mike put his hands in front of him, and everything around him was illuminated by a cold light, and he exhaled steam from his mouth. He lowered himself to the ground and touched it with his hands, causing it to freeze, and this ice moved towards the monsters. The ice reached the monsters and they found themselves bound by it. The man, wiping sweat from his face, told them not to dare underestimate them. But the next moment a crack appeared in the ice, and then, with a furious roar, the monster broke through its icy cage. Panicked, Mike wondered how they had managed to do it so easily. But suddenly Harry appeared in front of him with tin cans in his hands. Mike wondered when the man had managed to come here. Tossing one of the cans, Harry said with a grin on his face that these bastards must be really hungry since they decided to feast on people. And then he quickly waved his hand, and all the jars that were in his hands flew at the monsters. However, this only made the monsters even more angry. But then something cut the monster in half. Harry rushed forward, cutting through the monsters that were in his path, and he cried out, asking them if they knew who they were opening their mouths on. The man's eyes glowed green as the monsters' bodies fell to the ground, and he said that normal mobs should know their place. Scott and Charlie stared at this with their mouths open. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of the man's face, stating that he had destroyed the attractor. There were reports that he had increased his Divine Throne EXP and obtained a consumable material. A sparkling shard appeared on the man's hand, and a message appeared stating that consumables could be used to create new skills and relics. Clutching the shard in his hand, the man thought that despite the 50% penalty to his physical capabilities, moving didn't seem so difficult, and perhaps he could even use more energy than before. Mike thought that it was impossible for a man to easily destroy S-class monsters that even he couldn't stop. Harry approached Scott to return the knife he had taken from his house. Mike didn't take his eyes off him and wondered where he came from. But suddenly he remembered something. Then he called out to Harry, calling him an amateur, and he turned his head. And then he cried out that he was the same man who had attacked their followers, and Harry, hearing this, shuddered. And he immediately remembered the couple he had recently beaten. But then he hit the man in the face, telling him to shut up. Mike fell to the ground from the blow, and his body shook slightly. Harry asked him how he guessed. Mike exclaimed again, asking him how he could not recognize him. And then he pointed out that the man had put on the clothes and badge of the man he had beaten. And he said that this badge is an S-rank relic, given only to the Templars of the Twin Branch. And then he cried out that he was sure that all the man's strength was hidden in this badge, and Harry only disgustedly took it off himself and asked how this nasty thing ended up on him. And then he squeezed the badge with his fingers, destroying the abomination. Seeing this, Mike became even more angry. Harry dusted his hands and said that the relic was nothing more than a decoration, and he couldn't believe that those bastards hadn't changed a bit in 20 years. But suddenly a furious cry of a monster sounded next to them. Harry immediately put on a serious face and looked in the direction of the sound. Charlie also looked in that direction and pointed at something with his shaking finger. As it turned out, it was the Spider Queen, riding on a monster, chasing people. Then the men tensed up, and Harry's body was covered in green light. And then this light became even brighter, and streams of wind gathered around it. And a second later, he was already rushing forward. He rushed straight towards the Spider Queen. Flying closer, he raised his hand and struck the head of the monster on which the queen was riding. From this blow, the monster immediately fell to the ground, breaking the stone covering. People looked around in panic at the loud sound. Mike was also watching this, but he had absolutely no idea what the hell was going on. It seemed completely insane to him that the man would rush at this monster without any relic on him. Suddenly, a voice was heard in his ears, calling for the attention of all the Templars of the Gemini branch. Scott and Mike, who heard the voice, immediately realized that it was Bishop Simon. Simon told Scott and Mike to get out of that building immediately. He said that the people from the Aries branch intend to completely seal the building. He said that Victor was already on his way there and they couldn't stop him. And besides, even a saint couldn't handle the Spider Queen. That's why they decided to get rid of the place completely, because the saints would get into trouble if people found out about their failure. He asked Mike if he had a teleportation skill, and then he told him to take Scott and get out of there. The man's eyes began to dart nervously around the building. People were injured, and some could hardly move on their own. Everything was almost resolved, but the monsters continued to climb out of the crevice, and only Harry still fought with the Spider Queen. The man's body suddenly began to tremble. Simon asked him if there was any problem with them leaving together. With a crazy face, Mike replied that there was no problem. Scott cried out, asking what he was talking about. The outside help was clearly not enough. Didn't he understand how badly they were stuck? He asked him if he really wanted to leave all these people to die. After a short silence, the man replied that he understood everything. But what will people think when the Spider Queen appears in the middle of the city? Hearing this question, the guy froze and asked again. Mike replied that then people would begin to reproach the branches of the constellations, and their faith would weaken, and because of this, their power would also waver. He took out his phone and said that he could only take one person with him, and Scott would go with him, since he had been ordered to save him. Scott cried out that he couldn't leave his friend here to die, and besides, a lot of people hadn't had time to evacuate yet. The man gritted his teeth and said that now was not the time for his whims. He said he had no desire to die here because of an incompetent freak like him, and the man's hand began to turn into ice. Steam from the ice swirled around him, and he said he would have to kill all the extra cargo so the guy wouldn't have much of a choice. These words angered the guy, and a blue light appeared around him. The guy stood up and flashes of blue light flew around him. Coming closer, Mike asked him if he was really going to fight him. He said they were on completely different levels, and he needed to put his miserable conscience aside and make a rational decision. But before he could say anything else, something hit him in the back. As it turned out, it was the paw of a monster that was now pinning the man to the ground. Harry landed next to her on the ground and wondered why they were still here. He said that it was dangerous here, and therefore they should leave quickly. Charlie called out to the man happily, and Scott said that the draggers had blocked the exit so they couldn't get out of here. The guy said they should use either the teleporter or destroy all the monsters here. Looking around, the guy noted that there were currently a lot of wounded in the building, and the people from the Aries branch decided to seal the entire building. Harry, in response to this, cursed, saying that it was just a continuous headache, and Mike began to crawl out from under the rubble with groaning sounds. With a sudden movement, he rose to his feet, scattering the debris around him, and then he shouted for Harry to come to him. Harry said that he thought the man had already chickened out and ran away at the speed of light, to which the man yelled at him to shut up. Mike grabbed the phone and shouted that they would see who could get out of here alive, and maybe he could get out alone. But before he could press the button to teleport away, a web appeared behind him. As it turned out, it was the Spider Queen who launched a web at the man, grabbing him. Mike turned around in panic and swore quietly, Then the monster pulled on its web, throwing the man into its mouth. The phone fell out of his hands and hit the ground with a dull thud. Harry, without a second's delay, turned to the boys standing behind him. Turning around, he told them to take care of the wounded, and he would sort everything out here, and then he would join them. A green light enveloped his body as he said it wouldn't take long. Meanwhile, the Ares branching barrier continued to surround the building. Victor had already arrived at the scene, and he asked his subordinate about the current situation, to which he replied that their people had already practically sealed off the hypermarket. The building was cordoned off. Victor asked if the work was going too slowly, considering that they had started it long before his arrival. The branching people who created the barrier asked why the protection was not holding properly, as if something was about to break through. And at that very moment, a bright light illuminated the entire building. This caused a wind to rise, and Victor's subordinates began to defend their commander. And the next moment, a huge turquoise snake burst out of the building. Victor exclaimed, asking what the hell was going on here. Where did the snake come from? People ran out of the hypermarket with frightened screams. This crowd was met by Victor's subordinates, and the crowd screamed for help, and they said that there was some guy there alone fighting with the queen. Hearing this, Victor wondered what they were talking about because even he alone was not able to contain such monsters. And then he stepped forward and said that he would see with his own eyes, in response to which his subordinates exclaimed that it was dangerous. But this did not stop the man. And the next moment, a gust of wind arose, and the man's figure became blurry. Victor jumped sharply, pushing off the walls of the building and rose up. He jumped into one of the broken windows. Raising his head, he saw something that shocked him, and he cursed quietly. As it turned out, what he saw was the lifeless body of the Spider Queen. The man's face twisted into a frightened expression as he wondered who could have done such a thing. Looking around, he noticed that there was a real massacre here. He wondered what it was, whether someone was deliberately hunting the Spider Queen. Clutching his head, he said that his headache was getting worse with every second, and that he already had enough problems. Suddenly, he felt a familiar energy and looked somewhere to the side. Following this energy, the man ran to the window to see who it belonged to. Looking out the window, he saw a familiar figure and wondered what that bastard was doing here. As it turned out, that bastard was Hugo, who had already arrived in Korea. He stepped one foot on the edge and wondered if this could all be Hugo's doing. Then it would make sense. But then a voice came from behind him, asking if he missed him, and this made the man's body shudder. Harry, who appeared behind him, his eyes sparkling, asked him what was the matter, what was wrong. He asked him with a smirk on his face what that expression was, since they hadn't seen each other for so long. Victor immediately turned around to look at the other, but he was too shocked to speak. Meanwhile, rescuers arrived at the hypermarket and began evacuating people. And Charlie and Scott were sitting on the ground wrapped in blankets. Scott wondered if the man could really be Harry, because even though he looked different, his movements were definitely similar. Suddenly, someone shouted Scott's name. As it turned out, it was a breathless Hugo who asked the guy what he was doing. Turning away from the man, the boy asked him what he was doing there, to which he responded by asking if that was how one could greet one's own father. Hearing this, Charlie laughed and Scott just clicked his tongue in irritation. Hugo held his chin thoughtfully, looking cautiously at his son, and afterward he said that at least he was not injured, and a little medical attention would quickly return him to action. And then he asked him if he saw who did all this to the monsters, since he was in the building when it happened. But instead of answering, Scott only turned away from his father even more, and the man irritably thought about who he got his character from. And the guy asked his friend if everything would be okay with Harry. Hearing this, the man ran up to Charlie and grabbed him sharply by the shoulders. And then he shouted, asking the guy if he really knew Harry, and the guy asked again, not understanding. And then the guy said that now he understood who the man meant when he called him by that strange nickname. It turned out it was Hugo. And then he said that the man was in the hypermarket right now, and by the way, he defeated the Spider Queen, and he introduced himself to them as Harry. The man, still holding the boy by the shoulders, told him to describe everything in more detail. But before the guy could say anything, a loud sound was heard in the building and something hit the wall. Meanwhile, Victor was fighting with Harry. He jumped away from him, already out of breath. Harry was perfectly fine though, and he said it was too much. Wiping his face with his hand, he said that they met for the first time in 20 years, and the first thing the man decided to do was attack him. Victor asked the man how he managed to survive it all, and then he looked at his face and thought that the man looked very much like Harry, but where were his ugly scars? And his voice was different from before. He thought about how he looked too young, and then Victor shouted at him that this little bastard dared to imitate Harry, and he even got worried for a moment. Harry asked again, confused. Victor screamed that this bastard dared to deceive him, and therefore he would pay for it with his life. But Harry calmly asked what he was even talking about, and then he hit him in the stomach with a sharp movement, screaming that all this time he had been profiting from others, deceiving them. The man quickly flew back from this blow. But Harry didn't stop there, and with a quick movement he found himself behind the man to strike again. He hit the man again and he flew straight into the ground. Lying on the ground, Victor began to make muffled sounds, and Harry lowered himself to the ground and began to approach him. He said that he needed to teach each of them a good lesson, and then he asked about his life while he was imprisoned in the demonic tower. He asked and said that they had appropriated his relics and wealth and even divided his will. Clenching his fist in his hand, he said with a smile on his face that it was okay. He was going to finish them all off anyway. He began to list the order in which he would destroy everything he had, and the man began to shake with fear. Harry exclaimed that he would destroy everything he held dear, and it seemed to hit Victor hard on the head. Gritting his teeth, he thought that this couldn't be happening. As he rose to his feet, he thought that the man was not bluffing, because his manner of behavior and speech were so similar, and he had not even been able to recognize his movements. Could he really be that Harry? Could he really have escaped from the demonic tower? Victor stood up and said that all this was nonsense. And then everything was illuminated by a red light and Victor's body rose above the ground. Swords began to appear from behind his back, and the man told the other to prove to him that he was the same Harry. A magic circle with the image of Ares appeared under Victor, and swords emerged from the portal behind his back. Next, a hat and mantle appeared on the man's body like those of the emperors of ancient dynasties. A message has emerged that the sacred entity of the Aries constellation, the Jade Emperor, has revealed itself. Harry chuckled and asked if even a holy being had decided to honor him with its presence. Victor raised his finger, pointing at the man, his eyes glowing red, and red chains grew out of the ground around Harry. These chains began to wrap around his body, restricting his movements. Victor asked him if he still considered them weaklings. A wave of swords flew through the air, and the man said that he did not know how the other man managed to survive in that tower. Victor raised his hands to the sky, preparing to use the heavenly weapon to attack the chained Harry. A multitude of swords rushed towards Harry in waves. Harry said with an emotionless face that the Emperor's power was truly amazing. Victor waved his hand, shouting at him to shut up, and the swords sped up. And the swords flew in a furious stream straight at Harry. A multitude of swords fell upon the man, causing them to form a whole mountain. Victor, trying to catch his breath, thought about whether he had succeeded. He slowly began to approach closer, saying that it was amazing that he managed to escape from the demonic tower. But his self-confidence did not go away. Stopping in front of the mountain of swords, he said that challenging someone who had gained experience all these years with the help of his followers was such recklessness. He chuckled and asked if he really thought they had been standing still for all these 20 years. But suddenly a bright light began to burst out from under the mountain of swords. Noticing this, Victor immediately thought that this could not be. And then the bright flash flared up even more intensely, and some force began to break the swords. As it turned out, it was Harry, who quickly broke free from the swords and rushed forward to punch the man in the face. The blow sent Victor flying back to the ground, his teeth knocked out and his nose bleeding, as he wondered how the man had survived. If he really was that same Harry. Harry's shirt was torn to shreds. Scars appeared on his body and he stepped on it, angrily asking the man if he finally recognized him. And then Harry exclaimed that he had returned for their souls, and therefore they should prepare for the worst. Holding his nose, he said that even his weapon smelled like shit, while his wounds gradually healed. Noticing this, Victor thought that such a level of regeneration was impossible, even for Aquarius with her skills as a healer. Reports surfaced that Harry had survived death again, and that the power of the 13th skill was now unlocked. And Harry grinned and thanked the man for making him stronger. His eyes flashed with an evil light as he asked why he didn't try his new skill. Energy emanated from his body, tearing to pieces everything that came near him. And Victor, raising his shaking hands, begged for him to stop. But then there were reports that the sacred entity of Ares was watching Harry in shock. And the sacred entity was condemning Victor, asking why he was still alive. He was saying that this should not have happened. And then the sacred entity quickly leaves, shouting curses. Victor shook his head, shouting questions about why this sacred entity had left him. And Harry only asked with a smile whether he had really left before it was all over. He flexed his fists in irritation and, still smiling, said that he was so merciful that he would let him feel the pain that he himself had experienced. Meanwhile, Victor's men had already arrived at the destroyed building. One of them looked around and noticed something, and therefore asked what had happened here. As it turned out, there were many corpses of monsters lying on their path. Hugo, who entered the building with the others, suddenly felt something. His eyes lit up with a bright light as he felt a familiar energy. As it turned out, it was he who felt Victor's energy. He sighed, thinking that this was definitely Harry's doing. He was always causing trouble, and in the meantime, others had noticed Victor's energy. One of them asked why his energy had weakened so much, and the other wanted to suggest something. But Hugo appeared behind him, drawing his bow, and he asked everyone to step aside. The arrow shot forward, and an explosion occurred where it landed. Soon the entire building was filled with smoke, but Hugo continued to hang in the air. Landing on the ground, he quickly adjusted his jacket, and the flashes emanating from his body died down. He looked down somewhere and then quietly cursed at Harry. He looked at Victor's body, which was unconscious, and on his chest was a note that said, "Gone to the pigsty." Meanwhile, Harry had gotten himself some new clothes, and he was already standing in front of the stairs that led to Victor's house. Stopping, he said that this is where all his stolen relics were kept. He walked inside and there were a lot of people who had come to look at the exhibits. The man thought that he could smell the scent of his relics coming from somewhere. Coming closer, he noticed that they were all fakes. The clothes had been stolen from his house, but the screaming was definitely fake. Next, he got to the exhibit, which was a toothpick that he had used before. Pressing his hands to the glass, Harry exclaimed with a smile that he had finally found her. After some time, a siren sounded throughout the room, and people began to look around in fear. Bright red lights flashed and a loud sound filled the building. The security guards ran in a friendly crowd to Sector B, where the robber was located. Meanwhile, Harry had already broken the display case and pulled out his toothpick. A crowd of guards gathered at some distance from him and ordered him to raise his hands up, slowly put the object down and surrender. A light shone around the boy's body as he said that he didn't really feel like doing it. And then, with a slight movement of his hand, he waved the toothpick in his hands. And some force lifted all the guards up, and the man walked forward. He looked at the toothpick and said that old things were much better than new ones, while the guards' shouts were heard. Suddenly, a pink ball with a face appeared on the man's hand, and the man said he was glad to see it. And it turned out to be a Class S relic, a lump of slime that can recreate anything. The slime ball happily snuggled up to the man, and a message appeared stating that the conditions for obtaining the creation workshop skill had been met. And he could now create a 17-square-foot workshop, and he could now bestow his trait on the slime ball. A lump of slime settled on Harry's shoulder, and he asked him if they should head for the exit. Suddenly, a message appeared that a strong aura of the relic of the constellation Aries was felt nearby, and some door began to glow brightly to the side. The man said that he felt a bit sorry to leave here empty-handed. As he reached for the door handle, he said it was an exciting moment to receive the award. Meanwhile, Hugo reached Victor's estate, but looking around he asked if he was late. Everything around was in chaos. Victor's house was burning, and people were running away in a panic. Noticing him, Hugo prayed that Harry wouldn't do anything worse. Meanwhile, Harry, with a huge bag in his hand, which he dragged along the ground, left the estate, saying that he was hungry. Hugo noticed him immediately and called him by name. Hearing someone calling him, Harry looked up and immediately saw a man. Hugo ran forward quickly, tears streaming down his cheeks, and shouted that he was a bastard. Harry was about to meet him, but then the man ran past him. Hugo grabbed some guy by the shoulders and asked him what he was doing here and where he had been all this time. He needed to find him since he had returned. Noticing this, Harry angrily clenched his fur coats, and the lump of slime looked at its owner in fear. And then he jumped up and kicked the man right in the face, asking him how he could not recognize someone's face. Hugo sank to the ground, his body shaking slightly. Harry stood in front of him, towering over him, and asked him how he could not recognize him. Did he want to die? Holding his cheek, Hugo looked up in confusion, and then he noticed a clot of mucus on the man's shoulder. Harry raised his fist, saying that it looked like he still needed another punch. But then Hugo jumped to his feet and quickly rushed forward, hugging the other. Tears and snot ran down his face as he exclaimed that he had been alive all this time. But a second later, Harry hit the man in the stomach. Hugo sank to the ground again. Harry asked him how he dared to attack him like that, to which the man noted that he was definitely Harry. Suddenly, a message appeared that the sacred entity of the constellation Sagittarius, Apollo, had revealed himself. And then a bright light flashed behind Hugo and a man appeared. Hugo immediately turned around, completely confused about what was happening. The sacred entity rose above the men and looked down on them, and they wondered why he had suddenly appeared. Apollo rubbed his chin thoughtfully, looking at Harry. A report has emerged that the sacred entity of the Sagittarius constellation is doubting the veracity of Harry's survival. A message appeared that the sacred entity was offering to verify this, to which Hugo asked him how he was going to do this. A message appeared that the sacred entity Apollo was pointing his arrow at Harry, saying that everything would become clear when he shot him, in response to which Hugo grabbed the man, shouting that this was not possible, and Harry irritably said that he should just get rid of the homeless person. He indignantly asked why he had decided to point a gun at him in the first place, in response to which Hugo rushed forward, grabbed the guy by the shoulders and told him not to take it to his head, and that he did not want to insult him, while Apollo stuck his tongue out at the other man from behind his back. Harry said that since everything was fine, they should continue where they started, and Hugo pulled away, confused. And then Harry repeated the words he had told him on the phone. A demon appeared behind Harry and said that when he returned from the tower, he found that his house had been sold, his property had been appropriated, and the relics had disappeared somewhere. Hugo called out to the man uncertainly. He continued, telling him to let him hit him once. Harry still hit the man, which caused a bump to appear on his head. And then Hugo was finally convinced that it was Harry in front of him, but he thought that this freak had hit him hard. Meanwhile, guards ran out of the mansion shouting that they needed to return the stolen relics. Harry seemed to have just remembered that he was being chased, and Hugo asked him incredulously about what he had stolen. Pointing to his huge bag, the man said he had only stolen a couple of trinkets. Looking at the bag, Hugo exclaimed, asking the man if he really stole the relics from Victor's vault, to which he asked if that was really cool. Hugo rushed towards him asking what was so cool about it, and Harry just laughed. One of the guards said that they needed to catch the thief immediately, to which his superior replied that they couldn't handle him. And then he said that this rascal definitely wouldn't be able to cope with him, even though everyone considered him quite strong. Then the guard decided to suggest something. But before he could do so, there were sounds behind Hugo and Harry, and the former immediately turned around. As it turned out, someone jumped from the roof of the mansion. The head of security noticed that he was already here. A message appeared that the avatar of the Aries constellation Pishu had been discovered, and a warning appeared that he could steal his money and relics. The huge beast opened its mouth, from which came a loud roar. The men looked up at him and Hugo swore quietly. Afterwards, he suggested that the man leave all the stolen things and run away from there, to which he told him to just stand and watch. And then he grinned and said he had a plan. Harry turned to the slimeball named Lime, and he ordered him to give him the knife. Lime's eyes immediately lit up, and the outline of a knife appeared in them. And then a knife handle appeared from his mouth. Harry grabbed the handle and swung the knife sharply, searching for it from the clot of slime. Looking at the knife, he thought that it would not be suitable for fighting the avatar in this state. And then he told the knife to show its true form, and black lightning flashed around the man and a bright light appeared. Gusts of wind blew towards Hugo, and he shielded himself from them with his hand, wondering what kind of force this was. Meanwhile, a huge blade stuck into the stone of the platform. As it turned out, that small knife turned into a huge sword with a long blade. There have been reports that the awakened relic is imbued with the aura of the serpent bearer, and the relic has received more deadly characteristics thanks to the serpent hunter trait. There were reports that the power of the 13th had been strengthened. He could now see the weak points of his opponents. He was discovering the path of death. Harry happily noted that he had received a new skill, and he immediately decided to use it, causing the whites of his eyes to turn black and his irises to glow a bright turquoise light. He immediately noticed how some places on the beast's body began to glow. Harry quickly jumped up, swinging his sword to strike, and he exclaimed that it was time for him to stretch a bit. Hugo, who stood aside and watched, said that rushing at the enemy without thinking was the man's favorite tactic. He always overcame obstacles despite all his recklessness. It made him smile a little, and he thought that Harry was really back. The avatar, meanwhile, swung his huge paw, pinning the man to the ground. This caused Hugo to open his eyes wide and call out Harry's name in concern. But then the beast's paw began to shake weakly, and Harry asked why the man was so puzzled. With a slight movement of his hand, Gary lifted the beast's paw, saying that he almost died from the stench. And then he chuckled, asking if it was really his turn now. Looking at the man, the beast suddenly froze in fear. A second later, Harry swung his sword, sending the beast's severed paw flying high into the air. Feeling intense pain, the avatar screamed furiously. A warning has appeared that the Beast of Plenty is using its skill. And then the loud roar of the beast was heard again. And a message appeared that Pishu was absorbing all valuables that fell within the radius of action. But Harry held the sword in front of him, exclaiming that now the beast would definitely not escape punishment. He raised his hands, raising his sword behind his back, and a message appeared that the Ophiuchus trait had been activated. The man looked at the beast with glowing eyes and decided that one light cut should be enough. And then he swung his sword sharply, using his trait, and something black rushed towards the beast. A black sword swing immediately flew towards the avatar, smashing the ground. And then it hit the beast's chest, the cut running diagonally across the chest. The blow was so powerful that it affected not only the beast, but also everything behind it for several hundred meters. Now there was a huge furrow in the ground from the impact, and Victor's mansion was destroyed. In surprise, Hugo unconsciously raised his hand to cover his mouth, which had opened slightly. Looking at the man standing next to the beast's body, he thought that this power was comparable to what he had in his prime. There were reports that the man had defeated the Avatar, and his sacred throne experience had been increased. The question arose, does he want to have the Beast of Abundance as his avatar? As he got closer, Harry said that he thought only 12 saints could have avatars, and then he raised his hand to touch the beast's body. The avatar's body was immediately enveloped in light and slowly rose into the air. His wings immediately spread out. The beast immediately returned to normal, and reports appeared that the beast Pishu had become the avatar of the constellation Ophiuchus, the current number of avatars, 1. A report emerged that Pishu had shrunk in size to hug his owner, and the man had picked up the animal, which now resembled a soft toy. Harry exclaimed that it would be great to use the beast as a repository for his relics, and the man joyfully spun around with Pishu in his hands. And Hugo wondered when the man had managed to acquire such a skill to appropriate an avatar from another branch. A message appeared telling Harry to choose a new name for the beast, and he froze strangely. And then he shouted that he would name the beast Pigbank. After some time, Hugo and Harry reached the former's house, and Harry called the man a traitor, to which he shouted that he was actually very worried, to which Harry replied that he was so worried that he started a family and enjoyed life. Continuing to twist something in the toy horse, he began to wail, which only made Hugo clench his fist in irritation. Harry got up from the sofa, saying that he didn't want to bother the man with his presence, to which Hugo replied that everything was fine and he could stay here, since he was alone anyway. Then the man said that he shouldn't have brought up the subject to him, because it was probably too much for a man to talk about divorce, to which Hugo cried out that he wasn't divorced. Covering his face with his hand, he said that they needed to continue where they left off. And then he asked him about what was happening inside the demonic tower, and he himself was thinking that he shouldn't tell his family about Harry, because they were crazy about him. Hugo said that he stayed outside during that raid, and therefore didn't know what happened inside, and he asked about why the others came back with the red-eyed man's head, to which Harry replied that it was a very touching story. He said he was stabbed in the back and left to die in a tower, trapped in a monster-infested lair. And among the hordes of these creatures, the red-eyed one, whom he thought dead, returned to life. Hugo asked again in surprise, to which Harry replied that what they saw during the raid was not his real body. The real difference lay deep within, and even though he managed to win, the main pain in the ass was not the red-eyed one, but the tower administrator, who revived all the killed monsters again and again, but he continued to chop them down. Having finished off the last of them, he collapsed to the ground from exhaustion, and then he was already dead. But then, opening his eyes, he discovered that he had somehow found himself outside the tower, and at that moment he was filled with this strange power. But he is sure of one thing, namely that the bastard who stabbed him then was well aware of the structure of the tower, and therefore he threw him into that lair, knowing exactly what would happen to him. Harry said that sooner or later he would get to those who had appropriated his property, and the bastard who had stabbed him in the neck had received a special punishment, and therefore he needed to be well prepared. The man said that he needed to make server equipment, and then he released the toy horse into the air, and it hung in the air, enveloped by the man's power. There were reports that natural materials for making had been discovered, and the question arose as to whether he wanted to use them to create the relic. Suitable materials included the core of a spider queen, a fragment of a bad luck charm, and relics of the Aries constellation were also discovered. After looking at these materials, Harry said that perhaps he should mix them all together. He raised his hand forward, and the creation of a new relic began. A bright light shone from the windows of Hugo's house. There have been reports that a new B-class relic has been created. A new entity has been recreated. Grabbing the relic in his hands, Harry noted that relics with their own essences are capable of developing on their own. Hugo clapped his hands in admiration, and then he took a closer look at it and said that, considering that it was a very valuable relic, its design was simply disgusting. Then Harry responded by shouting that he had poured so much material into this relic, and he still dared to mock it. Turning away from the man, he said that he had thought of making something for him too, but now he had suddenly changed his mind. Then Hugo grabbed the man by the shoulder and said that he was just a master relic maker, and by disgusting, he meant that he simply could not feel the full aesthetics of the object he created. Harry hit the man on the head again. then put the item in the bag and said that he would still look at his behavior, and then said that he needed to somehow lure all the saints. Hugo replied that all the constellations would be unlikely to want to leave their residences, to which Harry, placing the chest on the table, said that this should be enough. Hugo exclaimed that it was the royal heirloom of Ares, and the message stated that this heirloom could multiply the number of items stored. The man asked another how he was able to obtain something that only Victor had access to. Harry replied that since his friend was the saint of the beggar constellation, he had brought the thing as a wallet, to which Hugo irritably replied that his constellation was not called that, and Harry only said that with the help of this box, he would be able to generate new materials in order to later create high-ranking relics. Then Hugo asked how he was going to activate it, since no one here could do it. Then Harry asked how that was possible, couldn't he? To which Hugo exclaimed that his constellation was Sagittarius. Harry stared at the table in disappointment. And then, looking at the chest, he said that he had a feeling that they would be able to activate it, to which the other said that nothing would come of it. Suddenly, Harry said that he had already sent an application to the news network. Hugo, thinking he had misheard, asked again, but the man continued tinkering with the box. Then the holy archer cried out, asking whether the man had really gone mad. Meanwhile, something was happening in the Blue House in South Korea. Several people gathered around the table and someone said that they were idiots, that they had disgraced themselves by not being able to deal with even one spider. As it turned out, it was Bishop Oliver of the Leo constellation branch who was sitting with his feet up on the table, and he said that they should have continued trading talismans. Why were they getting into battles with the attractors? Another man exclaimed that Oliver should refrain from such statements, to which the bishop said that he had heard that the Spider Queen had been killed by an unknown boy. Could it really be that Harry himself had risen from the grave? But suddenly someone exclaimed that it was enough, and the lamp that was standing on the table broke. As it turned out, it was Simon, who said with a smile on his face that the Lion Bishop must be very excited about Harry's achievements. Oliver said that it wouldn't have been difficult for Harry to destroy that huge creature, and then he asked if he saw that video from the burning Russia, to which Simon answered that the whole thing was that he was strengthened by other saints, and they even provided him with better weapons. He said that they would have done better in such comfortable conditions, in response to which Oliver laughed and asked if it was really just a matter of conditions. Simon said he wanted to emphasize that the Spider Queen was ultimately destroyed by the twins branching, at the cost of the life of an S-rank Templar. Oliver noted with irony it was such a big loss. The men fell silent, their auras glowing brightly around them. The man sat to the side of them, gritting his teeth, and wondered how it had happened that the Blue House had become a hangout for these thugs. Suddenly, someone burst into the room and told the president to turn on the news immediately. The news said that their news channel had just received a mysterious package. Inside were photographs of the holy sign of Ares, Victor, and the same short message. Judging by the results of the analysis, the handwriting matches Harry's. Meanwhile, Hugo, who had also found out what Harry had sent, shouted in irritation. He asked him what he was thinking about, to which Harry answered, sitting on the phone, that it was just an announcement. He was letting them know that soon their heads would be in his hands too. Hugo shook his head and said that Victor's death was already a huge problem in itself, and he decided to make it even worse. Hearing this, the man threw his head back and said, "Victor is not dead," Hugo asked again, and Harry said that he couldn't even be called alive. These words struck the saint even more. With a joyful smile, Harry pulled out a toy rabbit and announced that it was Victor. Hugo backed away in disgust, asking again. While stretching the rabbit's ears, Harry said that his skills had improved, and therefore he was able to trap Victor's astral body in this toy. Hugo asked if that was even possible, but Harry said that it wasn't important, and then he handed him the knife. The man said that this was the same knife that was stabbed into his back. Holding the knife in his hand, the saint thought that this was clearly not an ordinary dagger. Harry began to stretch the rabbit, and Hugo noted that since he was wounded with this knife, it was definitely not Victor. Then the man asked if he should apologize then. Throwing the rabbit over his shoulder, Harry said that he was going to visit the shopping mall. Hugo asked him why he wanted to do that. The man replied that the pig had told him that he had seen a blade of a similar shape there. Taking the clothes from Hugo, Harry headed for the exit, telling Slave 2 to guard the house. Hugo, holding Victor the rabbit in his hands, asked who the first slave was. Waving his hand, Harry headed out, saying goodbye to the first slave, Hugo. Victor's house was still destroyed. Some people were walking among the debris, looking at it. One woman, addressing the saint, said that, as expected, the constellation Ares was not there, and the aura of the sacred entity was not felt either. The saint, who was playing with the water that was pouring around her finger, asked again. Sophie, the saint of the sign of Aquarius, who was lying in the bathtub, asked where he could have disappeared to. The woman replied that perhaps he had taken his property and intentionally disappeared somewhere, to which the saint replied that if he had secretly conducted some kind of transactions with other saints, then everything would become more problematic. Sophie's face took on a serious expression, and her subordinate asked if it was possible that the supposedly returned Harry had kidnapped Victor. Hearing this, the woman laughed loudly. Throwing her head back, she turned to her subordinate with whom she was talking. She said that it was a very stupid joke, and in the meantime, the ball of water bound one of the servants who was nearby. Sophie's subordinate heard someone screaming. She immediately apologized, saying that she had spoken without thinking, to which the saint replied that everything was fine. They would visit the shopping mall as planned. They needed to get rid of the unnecessary relics before the auction began. Suddenly, another subordinate burst into Sophie's bathroom screaming that they were in trouble. She said that another saint decided to take part in the auction, which made the saint turn around sharply. Previously, this same saint was now in the gym. The men who were there looked at someone with admiration. A muscular man stood by the window with his back to the others. Someone approached him from behind and addressed him, calling him Mr. Stephen. He said they had received information that a relic belonging to Harry would be put up for auction. Hearing this, Stephen turned his head to look at the man. He dropped his hands sharply, causing the barbell he was holding to fall to the floor. Stephen smiled and asked if the time had finally come. Turning around, he said that they would take this relic for themselves. As it turned out, it was Stephen, the holy sign of Leo. Meanwhile, somewhere in another part of the city, a portal began to glow with a bright light, and someone came out of it. Harry said that portals were very convenient, and Scott, who was standing next to him, said that they were usually very expensive, but members of the twin branch could use them for free. As it turned out, Harry and Scott had reached the relic trading complex. Harry thanked the guy and said that he really needed an expert, and he volunteered to help him find the SS rank. Scott replied that he was happy to help, and he remembered Simon's words about him having to recruit the man at any cost. And then messages from the contact scumbag boss appeared on Scott's phone. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Harry asked if his boss was still pestering him, even despite the incident at the hypermarket. And then the man returned the knife in the boy's sheath, saying that it had greatly helped him in the battle with the bugs. Scott, taking the rod in his hands, said that it seemed to him that the blade had broken after that battle, to which the man replied that he had completely restored it, but its effectiveness would change slightly. Hearing this, Scott put the knife in his chest and thanked the man, who noticed that they had already arrived. Standing in front of the entrance to the building, he asked if there was an SS rank appraiser here. After some time, a man walking through the shopping area noticed something. Blushing, he asked what such a man was doing here. The man standing next to him also blushed. As it turned out, they all paid attention to the saint of the sign of Aquarius. She said she wanted to get rid of a few relics before the auction, to which the worker panicked and apologized, saying the appraiser was busy with another client. The woman replied that everything was fine and she would wait, but she herself thought irritably about how they dared serve anyone else when she was here. Standing in front of the entrance with her retinue, she wondered who was inside. Standing by the display case, Harry said that the prices of the items here were worthy of SS rank. The appraiser, holding a figurine in his hands, asked Scott who made it, to which Harry immediately responded, Virgo Branching Evaluator. Jean asked the man if he could be related to Harry in some way. Scott replied that the man was his impersonator, and the appraiser asked the guy to leave, saying that he needed to ask the client a couple of questions. Scott muttered something irritably, but still left. And then Jean asked the man about how exactly he was connected with Harry, in response to which he asked why he was asking. The appraiser said that many people don't know this, but Harry is famous not only for his fighting skills, but also for his skillful abilities. And the relic that he brought him is often counterfeited, but his instinct tells him that Harry himself had a hand in it. In response to this, Harry asked about the fact that the man was apparently well-informed, to which Jean replied that of course he was. And then he, blushing and looking away, said that he was his favorite student. These words discouraged the man and he asked again. He folded his arms across his chest and thought that he didn't remember having any students. The appraiser, continuing to examine the statuette, said that, given its age, it was unlikely that he had trained with it. But this work was truly amazing. He almost believed in its authenticity, and an irritated Harry wondered whether he should sue him as a fraud. Jean handed the man a notebook and said that he had received the item when he was Harry's apprentice. Looking at the notebook, the man thought that this was the same notebook that he had once lost. Could this appraiser be that annoying newcomer who followed him around in China? He was so deeply imprinted in his memory that he even missed him a little. And Jean said that Harry was truly a man with a fine sense of beauty. The man cried out that one day he suddenly disappeared, leaving this in his home. Hearing this, Harry thought he lost the notebook, but it seemed that this guy stole it. The appraiser began to leaf through the pages, saying that he could not decipher the handwriting, but was sure that there were many brilliant ideas hidden there. And Harry thought that this was just a list of his victims. He thought that after he woke up, he always received information from whatever he fought. But it seemed like this guy would be able to get more information. Jin handed the notebook to the man, saying that it should serve the young talent. Harry accepted it with joy, as it contained his very first sketches. There have been reports that the notebook's dormant magic is reacting to its owner's aura, and under the influence of Ophiuchus' magical power, the notebook has been transformed into a relic. Noticing this, Jean cried out that this was a relic of the memory type. It seemed that Harry had put a charm on it when he was still alive. But then someone shouted, telling Jin that they were in trouble, and the man turned around. He asked what was the matter, to which the worker answered, pointing to the door, where the saint was waiting outside. Jean muttered irritably that they were making such a fuss over a trifle, and Harry asked again. Meanwhile, Sophie was still standing on the street. She thought about how these worthless people dared to stare at her, and every time it was the same thing. Scott, standing in the crowd and drinking something from a straw, thought that he thought Sophie was too picky for such outings. Sophie said that they had been waiting too long already, so she thought that she should personally go in and hurry them up. And she herself was thinking that the damn appraiser should buy their relics at a good price so that they would have enough money for the auction, but he was making them wait too long. Sophie hurried to the door, but the worker grabbed her by the shoulder and stopped her, saying again that there was still a customer inside. But this only made the woman even more angry, and she wanted to know because of whom she was being treated, but why they were not putting her in the right place. And then she went inside anyway. Looking at Harry, who was standing in front, she opened her mouth wide. In front of her, she saw an unimaginable handsome man, with whom it would not be a sin to fall in love. She reached out her hand, thinking she wanted to look a little closer. But before she could get any closer, a huge snake appeared before her eyes, opening its mouth at her. The woman froze in fear and opened her eyes wide. And then her legs weakened and she sank to the floor, and her retinue immediately asked what was wrong with her. She, in a panic, wondered what she had just felt. She felt as if hundreds of poisonous snakes were wrapping around her entire body. The thought that she needed to run immediately sounded loudly in her head, and she abruptly took off. Jean asked why she ran away so abruptly, to which Harry replied that she probably felt ill. A message appeared that a subordinate of the sacred essence dared to approach Ophiuchus. The opponent's divinity has transferred to Ophiuchus, the current indicator, 35%. Divinity is a sacred power needed to support the power of a holy entity. Divinity can be stolen from followers of other branches. If it drops to 0, the sacred throne will begin to lose its power, and its owner will become vulnerable. Harry asked Jean if the girl who came in recently was really a saint, to which the appraiser replied that it was Sophie, the holy sign of Aquarius, which greatly surprised the man. And then Harry laughed out loud because she turned out to be that saint. He thought that she had changed so much that he hadn't even recognized her yet. She had certainly become prettier, but her rotten soul remained. If you categorize the things he despised, which included fish bones, vermin, and sewage, Sophie would be a vermin he didn't even consider human. Jean said that he didn't understand why they called her a saint, because she actually had a very selfish character, in response to which Harry again noted that he was well aware. Jean said that Sophie once tried to take over Harry's property by claiming that she had provided him with healing services. But she failed, and the matter was handed over to the government. The appraiser noticed that the woman almost called the man by name. Did they really know each other? Harry replied that they were old friends. Meanwhile, Sophie ran off somewhere into a quiet alley. She leaned her hand on the wall and leaned forward, her subordinate running after her. Sophie thought that for some reason she remembered Harry's face. She asked her subordinate if she had ever been so scared that death seemed a more enticing option. After she ordered her to go back to the pawn shop and find out who the man was, her subordinate then asked what to do with the appraiser. After a short silence, she wanted to say something, but suddenly stopped short, and then she said with a smile that she had changed her mind. Turning around with wild eyes, she told her to just kill them. Her subordinate replied that he was from the branch of the Virgin and they needed to sell him relics, to which the saint replied that she could kill him under the pretext that he had insulted her and the other had embarrassed her. Taking the pendant from her neck, she said that she would even give her a relic and lend her a piece of the sacred essence's power. But the woman objected, saying that magic was forbidden to use in a peaceful zone. Without showing any open aggression, Sophie asked her if she dared to refuse to carry out her orders. The woman immediately looked away and said that the wish of a saint is the wish of a sacred entity. And then she knelt down to accept the pendant. After accepting the pendant, she continued, saying that the desire of a heavenly being is the desire of heaven itself, and therefore she cannot resist the order of one of the 12 saints who support the whole world. After some time, Harry, who was still with the appraiser, noticed that water was dripping from the ceiling. Meanwhile, something was happening in the relic trading complex, the central area. Scott walked the streets, sipping from a glass. Suddenly, his gaze caught on something on the ground. There was a puddle under his feet, although it was not raining. The guy leaned closer to the water, thinking that he felt the slightest bit of magical energy emanating from it. And suddenly, a hand of some creature appeared from the puddle. In surprise, Scott let go of his hand and his glass fell to the ground. Meanwhile, a water creature that looked like a guy was crawling out of the puddle. Scott stepped back, wondering what the hell was going on. But suddenly he heard a loud sound and turned around sharply. As it turned out, this situation happened not only to him. Sophie stood on the roof watching this and she laughed quietly. She waved her hand, summoning a duplicate mirror. With a gentle smile on her face, she said that the creatures were of the same strength as A-rank Templars, but they would not be able to cope with such an army. Scott turned to his subordinate Sophie, who was walking down the street. He yelled, asking why she was using skills in a peaceful area, and then he told her to stop it. The woman turned around and said that it was the saint's order, so there was nothing to worry about. She said that everything they do by the will of the gods. And then she activated the relic that was in her hands, and the cup glowed brightly. Scott lunged forward to snatch the cup from her hands, but he didn't have time to do this, and a huge column of light flew into the air. A huge number of water balloons appeared in the air, which trapped the people who were in the square. The woman ordered the water creatures to seize the appraiser, and she would deal with him herself. And the creatures, obeying her command, turned into water and quickly ran away. Scott also found himself trapped in a water sphere. He thought that he needed to get out before he lost consciousness. A small flame appeared on his palm. The guy thought that he needed to get out at any cost, but soon his eyes began to close. Meanwhile, water was collecting on the pawn shop ceiling. Jin noticed that he felt strange currents of magic. And at that very moment, water tentacles appeared and grabbed the man. Suddenly, someone pointed a blade at Harry's neck, and Sophie's subordinate ordered the man not to move. She said that there was nothing personal here, but he dared to offend the saint. She told him to behave without stupidity if he did not want bloodshed. The appraiser was bound with water tentacles, and the woman said that the saint had ordered her to kill them both. But if they apologized and their relics were bought at a high price, then perhaps they would be forgiven. Jin didn't answer, but just looked away, frowning. But then Harry said that people weren't allowed to brandish knives in public places, causing the man to look up in surprise. Harry, saying he had no intention of using a weapon, took the knife blade between two fingers and broke it. And then he told the appraiser not to forget to ask them to compensate for the damage caused. The appraiser looked at the man, thinking that he had managed to destroy the gift of the Aquarius constellation with his bare hands. This angered the woman, and she exclaimed that she had told him not to make a move. And then the water tentacles released Jin to rush towards Harry. But the man merely waved his fist, and the water immediately parted from him. Turning to the woman, he asked her if she had more. The sensations were simply amazing. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and thought about how the man had easily destroyed the A-class avatar. She knew that the saint had become ill for a reason. Looking at him, she thought that he was dangerous, and she needed to deal with him as quickly as possible. She pulled out the pendant that the saint had given her and exclaimed that he would do nothing against it. Streams of water burst from the pendant and landed on the floor, and the woman exclaimed that they were created by the saint herself, and she summoned orange-class creatures, water wolves. Looking at the wolves, Harry said with a smile that these pests were glad to see him. Turning his back to the appraiser, he suddenly called him by name, and then he said that he would borrow these blades from him since he had told him to take whatever he wanted. And suddenly he jumped up. Harry ran sharply straight towards the wolves. With sharp movements of his hands, he began to chop down the wolves, and he noted that these daggers were very good. As he continued to hack at the wolves, he exclaimed that these wolves were no stronger than yard dogs, probably because the weapon was above A rank. A message appeared stating that the information had been collected, a fragment of a duplicate mirror, but the man continued to hack at his opponents. There have been numerous reports of new skills and buffs being added. Sophie's subordinate froze uncertainly, not believing how easily the saint's calls were destroyed. But then the man turned to her, and her eyes widened in fear. Turning to her, he told her that they were not finished yet. The image of a snake immediately appeared in the woman's mind. Her body began to shake slightly when she thought that the man was on a completely different level, and if she tried to attack him, she would die on the spot. Then she quickly ran through the open doors, shouting that this was not the end. Harry chuckled and replied that the idiots who shouted that it wasn't the end were the most pathetic. Jean stared at Harry, and then suddenly someone called out to the man with concern. It turned out to be Scott, who exclaimed that he had been attacked by a Templar from the Aquarius branch and had barely escaped. And immediately he saw a view of many bodies of wolves lying motionless on the floor, and he asked what had happened here. Scott asked if these weren't the saints' calls, to which Harry replied that they were. But by sending such gifts, they only gave him more resources. The guy said that they should leave before the next attack anyway, but suddenly someone called out to them, asking them to wait. Jean thought about how he had followed Harry everywhere 20 years ago, and therefore he remembered very well how he collected materials after each battle with monsters. He noted that this fighting style was as if the demon himself was fighting. Could it be that he was Harry? But the man didn't answer but only raised his finger to his lips, and then he smiled meaningfully, looking at the man. Jin, noticing this, smiled, and his eyes filled with tears. As he headed out, Harry said that he would be back for the materials, so he asked to keep an eye on them, and besides, he still had some questions. In response to this, the appraiser bowed respectfully, loudly saying goodbye to the man, and he and the guy had already left the building. Scott asked the man why the saint had attacked him, whether he had offended her in any way, to which he responded by telling the guy to wait a little. The man frowned, but there was a smirk on his lips, his eyes shining with a bright light as he said that he would soon see something funny. After some time, they reached a cafe in the area. There were many different sweets and ice cream on their table, and Harry ate it all with pleasure. The man exclaimed that the ice cream there was simply superb, and he told him to eat as much as his heart desired. Scott replied hesitantly that it might be too expensive, to which Harry replied that everything was fine because he had picked up the thing that had fallen out of that woman's pocket, and it seemed to come with many privileges. He said that it was called an emblem, and that it functioned like a bank card, but that he could even rent other people's skills with it. Scott, leaning closer, noted that he hadn't even noticed that it had the Aquarius emblem on it, and he thought that they might have a problem, since it also served as an ID. But Harry just continued eating the sweets, telling the guy not to worry and that they would think about it later. But then Simon came up behind them and told Scott that he didn't think he liked the ice cream there either. The guy turned around in surprise, and Harry decided to tear his gaze away from his plate. Simon came closer and asked them if they minded if he joined them. Harry looked sternly at the man, continuing to eat ice cream, and thought that this was probably the same boss who had been bothering the guy. Simon sat down on the empty chair and introduced himself to Harry, saying that he was the bishop of the twin branch, and then he asked if Scott had told him anything about him, but the man seemed more interested in the ice cream. Looking at the man, Simon said that Scott said that he met a mysterious man who managed to defeat the Spider Queen when Victor failed. Harry asked, chewing ice cream, "What business did the man have?" The man replied that recruiting promising awakened people was one of the bishop's main responsibilities. Harry asked what he could offer him then if he wanted to hire him. Simon mentioned that the upcoming big auction would be for one of Harry's 8 legendary heirlooms, and then he asked why they didn't continue their conversation while enjoying the auction process. Hearing this, Harry put his spoon down on the table, and then he smiled while the ice cream was smeared across his lips, and he said that the man knows how to intrigue. He asked how far the auction house was from here. Simon, extending his hand, said that it was not far at all, and since such rare relics would be the lots, it was decided to hold the raffle in an appropriate place. He said that this place is located at an altitude of 16,000 feet above the earth, where the largest auction house is located. He said that this place is the floating city of Drachma. Meanwhile, something was happening in the large auction house of Drachma. Still suspended, Sophie sat there in the chair by the window. Her hands clutched to her chest as ragged breaths escaped her. Her whole body was shaking, and her gaze darted around the room. But then someone called her, and he placed a glass of ice on the armrest. Stephen told the woman to get lost if she planned to cower in the corner, shivering, and he raised his hand to take a sip of alcohol. Sophie shot him an irritated look, and she thought that he was still a stupid, uncouth lout. But today, she needed to control herself. She thought that this was the strongest person who had even managed to surpass Harry, and therefore there was no place safer than next to him. Getting up from his chair, the man said that in any case, Harry's relic would become his, so there was no point in her even claiming it. The man walked towards the exit when Sophie asked him where he was going, to which he replied that it was none of her business. Stephen walked out of the room, and the woman remained sitting in the chair and did not answer him. She sighed as she looked out the window and told herself that she just needed to calm down. She thought about the fact that this was Drachma after all, so whoever that person was, he wouldn't be able to get in here. But then her gaze caught on something outside the window. As it turned out, she noticed Hugo, who was also in the floating castle. She thought with a smile that the desired guest had appeared at the perfect time. Hugo, as it turned out, was wandering around the palace looking for Harry, not understanding where he had disappeared to. He thought that, knowing his character, he was sure that he would come here, because the city of Drachma was a real treasure trove of precious relics, and meanwhile someone was sneaking up on him from behind. Sophie tapped the man on the shoulder, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. She tilted her head to the side and asked how he was doing, her face hidden by the hood. Hugo turned to look at the woman and noticed with irritation that it was Sophie. She crossed her arms over her chest and said that she still couldn't get through to him. Propping her chin on her hand, she said with a grin that it seemed time spares no one, because he used to be such a handsome man. His face had changed a lot. Leaning forward, she asked if it could be because he had few followers, but Hugo just told her to fuck off, as he didn't want to talk to her at all. But this didn't upset the woman at all, although she asked if he was really going to ignore her again. And then she said that at this rate, his son could suffer the same fate as his wife. Sophie looked at his back with a smile and asked if his wife was still alive. And then she herself answered that her condition was indistinguishable from death, and that this shame had been brought upon her house by none other than the head of the family. Hearing this, Hugo looked at her furiously, his eyes and hair lighting up with fire. And suddenly, an explosion thundered in the room. The man stood in front of the woman, and the wall behind her was completely destroyed. Hugo said in a menacing voice that he told her to get lost. In response to this, Sophie simply raised her hand to her face to hide her smile. And then she dispersed, pushing the man's hand aside with her other hand. And she said that he, like a good boy, managed to restrain himself. And she had already thought that he had forgotten about the contract that they had all signed 10 years ago. And then her serious gaze darted to Hugo, and drops of water flew around her face. A water ball appeared in one of her hands and she raised her other hand, causing a vortex of water to swirl from above as she said that she should teach the arrogant boy a lesson. But then someone shouted at her from behind, which made her turn around. And when she turned around, she immediately felt a flick of fingers on her forehead. The woman's eyes rolled back, her forehead turned red, and she began to fall to the floor. Unconscious, Sophie fell heavily to the floor as Harry watched. Hugo quickly turned around, his mouth wide open in surprise. Harry noticed with surprise that Hugo was there too, and he asked him what he had forgotten there, to which the saint answered that he was worried about him, and he himself was thinking that he could not take his eyes off him. Harry asked again, and then he asked if he really had a crush on him, to which Hugo told him not to talk nonsense. Then Harry looked at Sophie lying on the floor and asked with disgust why he kept bumping into her. And the man wondered if she had fallen in love with him too. And Hugo thought that his friend really had problems with his head. Meanwhile, Sophie was thinking about Harry, the 13th constellation, recognized as the strongest. She always disliked him and even feared him. After all, his face was covered with disgusting scars. He had a cruel disposition that spared no one who stood in his way, and that arrogant look. One day 20 years ago, there was a severe thunderstorm outside. Harry, in a hospital gown, with a broken arm, burst into some castle and the servants began to stop him. One of the maids stood in his way with her arms spread wide, and she said that he was in the residence of Aquarius. And then she asked him to leave this place. But Harry just looked at her sternly and ordered her to get lost. The maid ran away in panic when someone asked him what she should understand by this. It turned out it was Sophie, and she asked how he dared to break into her house. But before she could say anything else, the man slammed his fist against the wall next to her, causing her to scream in fear. Leaning closer to the woman, Harry asked if she really wanted to die. Sophie asked him what he was doing, to which the man replied that he had sent her to the rear to help heal people. So why the hell was she loafing around here? He grabbed her hand and exclaimed that many had lost their arms and legs because they tried to save her worthless life. Harry walked forward, pulling her along with him, and he said that she herself had said that she intended to help people as soon as she arrived. So let her go and keep her promise. Sophie cried out, asking what difference it made if a couple more people died, and they, on the contrary, should be happy that they had the chance to save her. She screamed that she had skin problems because of it, and she was not going to go there for some stupid choirs. Hearing this, Harry stopped and turned to look at her. Sophie turned away from the man, covering her nose, and told him to get lost now that he finally understood. And then she jerked her hand to break his grip. She pulled her hand back in disgust, asking him why he had squeezed it so hard. But the next moment, Harry swung his hand and hit the woman on the cheek, and he shouted loudly that it seemed like he would only achieve something when he beat all this nonsense out of her. And in the end, Sophie was forced to treat everyone until they lost consciousness. But then she heard a voice asking her how much longer she was going to sleep. Hearing him, she came to her senses and looked at the man. Sophie found herself tied to a chair, and she stared in shock at Harry, who was sitting opposite her. And then her loud, piercing scream was heard throughout the entire castle. And then she screamed that they should untie her immediately. How dare they treat a saint like that? Harry noted that she hadn't changed at all in 20 years, to which Hugo sighed wearily. Sophie thought that they wouldn't get away with it that easily, because she was no longer the same girl she had been before. She thought that it would not be difficult for her to melt this rope, and her hands glowed with a blue light. A sphere of water appeared behind her, and she thought with a smirk that she couldn't be held back by something like that. But suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by another click on the forehead. Harry stood up from his chair and told her that it was written all over her face. But then he noticed that his fingers were smoking, and he asked what it was. Sophie screamed that an acidic layer had been placed on her, protecting her from all external attacks. So now all this acid will spread throughout his body and eat him away from the inside. But then Harry showed her his middle finger, which was already fine, saying that the wound had already disappeared. Noticing this, Sophie's mouth opened wide, noticing that the melted tissues instantly reformed. The man said with a smile that it was time for them to get back to everything that had happened between them. He said that he heard how she lied to everyone, taking credit for his recovery after the battles, for which she deserves a blow. And it was she who sent her subordinate to the appraiser, for which another 5 blows, and she also said all sorts of things to Hugo, for which another 50 blows. But then Sophie cried out, asking him to wait, and the man asked again with his hand frozen in the air, and then he just stared at her silently. And just a second later, he moved his hand forward, thinking that he had waited long enough. And Harry began to hit Sophie while Hugo calmly drank tea. He glanced at them out of the corner of his eye and thought that Harry was really good at beating the crap out of people. But then he felt something strange, as if Harry's divinity was growing with each blow. And, as it turned out, Hugo was not mistaken, and many reports appeared around the man about the increase in his divinity. After a while, Harry stopped because he noticed that Sophie's head was hanging, and he noted that the woman had passed out. There have been reports that divinity has been unlocked. The current level is 50% and requires recharging. Noticing this, Harry asked to be reminded of what divinity was. There have been reports that divinity is the power of the sacred essence needed to maintain the energy of the saint. Divinity can be opened in followers of entities other than his. If it falls to 0, then the sacred throne will lose all power. Such a flight outcome will lead to death. Harry thought about how by kicking the saints' asses he was taking away their divinity, and then he realized that he hadn't beaten it out of Victor because he couldn't do it yet. Harry thought with a smile that he needed to become stronger anyway. At this point, Hugo asked the man if he had thought it would be worth questioning Sophie about the dagger. Harry replied that the woman would not have had the courage to attack them, and he had found someone who could look at the dagger, and Hugo thought that he was mocking her just for fun. At this point, Harry grabbed something in his trouser pocket. Taking his phone out of his pocket, he noticed that it had already been so long. Hugo asked him where he got the smartphone, to which the man replied that he borrowed it from a guy. Smiling at Hugo, he told him that it was time for him to run, so he should clean up here, and he could throw Sophie in the trash. Harry ran to the elevator, saying that he would call him after the auction. Hugo sighed wearily and turned to look at the unconscious Sophie. But then the elevator door swung open again, deciding that Harry had returned for something. Hugo turned to him and asked if he had forgotten anything. But it wasn't Harry. And the man thought that of all the people here, it was he. As it turned out, it was Stephen. Stephen's gaze dropped to Sophie, who was still tied to the chair, her head drooping to her chest, and then he looked up at Hugo. The man called out threateningly to the other, sparks flying around his body, and he advised him to explain. But after, having calmed down a little, he reached out to take off his glasses and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And then he noticed with a grin that the archer was not happy about their meeting. Hugo asked him what he was doing there, to which Stephen replied that he and Aquarius had made a deal. She asked him to be her bodyguard. He still had business in Drachma, so he agreed. Stephen asked Hugo why he was there, to which he replied that he had my business too. The man asked him if he was really after Harry's relics, and Hugo then asked if they were being auctioned off today. Stephen grinned and replied that he, like a pathetic constellation, would never have been able to afford them anyway. In response, Hugo chuckled and asked the man if he was really just going around picking up Harry's relics. He said that he had tried to ignore him for a long time due to a growing inferiority complex, and had even gone so far as to start picking up all of his relics. Hugo asked Stephen if he really thought he could become as strong as him. Stephen's nostrils flared in response, and suddenly an explosion thundered around him. There were also flashes of light around Hugo's body, and he thought that the man had gone crazy at the mention of Harry, as he expected. Stephen pulled his hand back to strike the man, his hand shining like a bright flash, and then he grabbed Hugo by the wrist. He squeezed his hand so hard that even the veins stood out. He told him to stop talking nonsense, his eyes flashing with an evil light, and he told him to stop talking nonsense about this weakling. He jerked his hand sharply, breaking Hugo's wrist, and he sternly told him not to dare speak Harry's name in his presence again. His eyes flashed with rage as he said that he had been stronger than him for a long time. But then someone ran out of the elevator calling out to Stephen, saying that they had problems. The man yelled about the twins branching off buying up all of Harry's memorabilia, causing Stephen to turn around sharply. He turned back to Hugo and said he didn't have time to mess with him, and he slapped his hand away with a sharp movement. Stephen headed for the exit, telling Hugo to do whatever he wanted with Sophie, to which Hugo exclaimed, "Didn't he come here to save her?" The man replied that the relics were much more important. He needed to get there as quickly as possible. Turning around, he told the archer to choose his words more carefully in the future if he wanted to live longer. Hearing this, Hugo grinned and thanked the man for the advice. And then Stephen left the room. The elevator doors slammed shut with a dull thud. Sophie was still unconscious. The grin fell from Hugo's face and he cursed under his breath. Looking at his injured hand, he thought that the man didn't even consider him a weakling. Meanwhile, the auction was in full swing, and the twin branch made a bid again. The presenter cried out that the lot was once again being taken over by the twins branching. She announced that the first stage of the auction had come to an end, and the second stage would begin immediately after a short break. Harry, with numerous bottles of alcohol on the table in front of him, joyfully exclaimed that he had got another lot. Simon, who was sitting in the chair next to him, congratulated the man and said that he could buy himself whatever he wanted. Harry scratched his head and said that the man was too kind because he invited him to the VIP room and bought him everything he asked for. Simon adjusted his glasses and replied that it was the least he could do. And Scott asked him if he was sure, as they had already spent an obscene amount of money. Looking at the guy, the man replied that everything was fine. And then he asked him if he could pay for the alcohol, since he had forgotten his card. Scott agreed, but he was thinking that he had already spent a lot today, but he couldn't argue with his boss. But then Harry, holding the card between his two fingers, replied that everything had already been paid. Noticing the card in the man's hands, Simon checked his pockets and realized it was his card, and then he wondered how he had managed it. Waving the card, Harry said that Simon looked pretty drunk, so he paid in advance. He couldn't force his subordinate to pay, could he? In response to this, the bishop replied that he was just about to pay with his card, and he himself thought that the man was still so young and already so rude. Still, he's a damn genius for defeating the Spider Queen, and if he can recruit him, it'll all be a small price to pay. He leaned forward and said that since they were feeling a little relaxed, they should get back to the main topic. And there was a pink gas in the air. Simon began to say that he had high hopes for the man's future, and he thought that he had a chance to become an S rank or even higher. Harry didn't listen to him, but thought about the fact that this fog that covered the mind control was practically invisible to anyone. And although the effect was not that strong, it made him trust this idiot more. Simon continued, saying that he could even make him a cardinal. He promised him untold riches. He also promised him great glory. But, among other things, he promised him the respect of the great leader of the twins. An inspired Simon extended his hand to Harry, offering him the chance to be reborn as a follower of the Gemini constellation. But in response to this, Harry only laughed loudly. After stopping laughing, the man remarked that he had been laughing too much lately, and then he asked the bishop if this was really what he wanted. Does he really want him to become another one of his worthless god's lackeys? This change of mood took Simon by surprise, and he decided that he needed to change the subject as soon as possible, and he said that there was a misunderstanding. Then someone knocked on the door and announced that the one relic had arrived, and the man turned around happily, and he immediately told the woman to come in, and she opened the door, going inside. Approaching Harry, she handed him the relic on a tray, saying that all the certificates were ready. But then Simon asked in surprise if he had really won Harry's relic. Taking up a gold pendant on a wide chain, Harry replied that he himself had told him to choose anything, even if it was not exactly what he was looking for. Remembering Stephen's obsession, the man nervously ran up to Harry, saying that this relic already had an owner. And at that very moment, a loud explosion broke the door to the room. Everyone present stared at this. As it turned out, it was Stephen. The man angrily asked who dared to touch his relics. Harry turned around and asked if it was Stephen who had laid claim to the relic. Simon hastened to reassure Stephen, saying that their newcomer had made a mistake, but they would immediately return the relic. Folding his arms across his chest, Stephen replied that he would turn a blind eye to it then. Simon thanked him and quickly agreed to this, and he said that they could pay later. But then the man said that it was thanks to them, because he had not spent a penny on the relic. Simon asked again, to which Stephen chuckled. Grabbing the man's head with one hand, he asked irritably if they really thought they could touch his things with impunity. The bishop stood motionless, thinking that because of this small oversight, he wanted to leave them without tens of millions of dollars. But then Harry intervened in the conversation, asking what they were talking about. The man happily said that he had won the auction, so this relic was now his, and if he wanted to take it, he should pay him $200 million. Hearing this, Stephen froze in silence, and then he laughed loudly, saying that it seemed that among the twins' branches there were not only cowards. Simon looked at Harry with a face full of horror. Stephen pushed the bishop away and walked forward, saying that he liked the man, that this is what a real man should be like. Coming closer, he asked him why they didn't introduce themselves to each other. Stephen extended his hand to Harry, lightning swirling around him, and said that he always greeted new acquaintances very warmly. Harry asked him what he was talking about, and he thought that the guy had managed to increase his strength slightly. This is to be expected from the constellation Leo, which specializes in battles. Looking at the man, he thought that he would not calm down until he destroyed someone. Stephen, meanwhile, reached out to the man as if she was about to pounce on a snake. The saint placed his hand on Harry's shoulder, and everything around him lit up with bright flashes. Concerned, Scott called out to Harry. Simon swore quietly and thought that he had indeed provoked him. With a grin on his face, Stephen said he was glad to meet him and hoped the man enjoyed his life in a wheelchair. But then Harry, whose t-shirt was burned under the man's hand, asked him what he was doing. He asked if he was trying to brush dust off his shoulder. Noticing that the man was fine, the saint froze in shock, thinking that the blow had hit the target. He asked him if he had dodged it with teleportation, to which Harry, pushing his hand away, said that he was still as slow-witted as ever. Smiling, he asked the saint if he really thought that the crushing cliff blow, which he himself had come up with, would work on him. Harry said that the man had sworn to him that he would use this skill for the good of people, but now he used it to boast about his power. Hearing this, Stephen asked the man who he was, and fear spread through his body. But then the auction host exclaimed that the auction would soon be reopened for bidding. Stephen noted with surprise that it was already time for the second stage, but Harry was not enthusiastic about this. Stephen pointed his finger at the man and said that he had a lot of questions, but right now there were more important things to do. The saint headed for the exit, telling him to keep the pendant, as he would come back for it. Scott ran up to Harry and asked him if he was okay. Simon thought that even he couldn't dodge the saint's skills. He wondered who this guy really was. The presenter said that they would begin the second stage with the highlight of the auction. She asked if they knew about the Berlin Wolf incident that happened 24 years ago, which was a mystical case of the appearance of a bad luck figure in Germany. It was a real hell, in which even armor and weapons melted. The 12 saints were unable to find a solution, and all their raids ended in failure. But then, Harry came along and managed to defeat that invincible monster, and today, they had the chance to become the owner of that very relic with which Harry had put an end to the monster's existence. Stephen, who had already reached the auction hall, thought that this weapon would finally be his. And he remembered what happened those same 20 years ago. A helicopter was flying over the island. The reporter sitting in it spoke on camera about how they were currently above the island where the Berlin Wolf had appeared. 4 days have passed since Harry, the 13th to awaken, arrived, and no one has come out since then. The situation remains unknown. In order to find out what was happening, several saints tried to enter inside, but were unable to do so due to the overwhelming energy of the island. Stephen was sitting on a stump when a subordinate approached him, saying that they were already at their limit. The man folded his arms, wondering how Harry could have gotten in there when they couldn't even get close. Why does he feel envious of a guy who wasn't even chosen by the gods? What's the difference between them? He was still wondering what he was missing when his subordinate exclaimed that Harry had appeared at the exit. Stephen looked up, taken aback by this. Reporters also noticed Harry coming out. The man, not at all wounded, came out of the forest, and in his hands he had a bone weapon. Reporters called this moment the return of a hero. Stephen's subordinate said that Harry had once again taken all the credit, and the saint, rising to his feet, said that he finally understood. Walking forward a little, he told his subordinate to tell everyone that they were returning. Moving on, Stephen threw away his weapon, and his subordinate asked him if he would take it back, to which he replied that he no longer needed it. He said he found something better. Stephen smiled widely, thinking that he had finally found what he had been missing. Meanwhile, the auction host announced that the weapon used to defeat the Berlin Wolf would be up for grabs today. Scott and Simon moved closer to the glass. This announcement also surprised Harry. Stephen, however, was eagerly awaiting the start of the auction, thinking that he would finally get his hands on it. The bone weapon was revealed to all the guests, and Stephen thought that he would finally have Harry's relic, which would make him truly the strongest. Meanwhile, something was happening outside the auction hall in the castle. As it turned out, there was a white dragon sitting on the roof of one of the towers. His eyes turned red as he noticed he could feel her, and he felt Harry's relic, its power. The presenter abruptly folded the cloth that covered the relic and announced that it was the bone of a demonic beast. Exclamations of admiration and surprise began to echo throughout the hall. The presenter asked who would become the owner of this powerful relic with historical and practical value. Scott and Simon were upset that this relic was put up for auction and that it would go to the Leo constellation, but Harry came closer. He thought that he had been thinking about what it would be, but for it to… Harry turned to Scott, but he cried out that now was not the best moment. The boy and the bishop began to press themselves against the glass, desperately wanting this relic to be theirs. The presenter announced the starting bid at 1 million. Immediately there was a noise. People began to actively raise the stakes. Harry was faced with numerous reports that his fame had increased. He asked why everyone was suddenly so alarmed, to which Scott irritably shouted that it was a legendary weapon created by Harry. Turning back to the window, the guy noticed that such a reaction from people was quite expected. But Harry remained irritated and silent. Scott said that no matter what Harry created, it was always of the highest quality, and that's why everyone wants to get their hands on them. He said that this is especially true for the constellation Leo. Stephen. He is ready to go to the ends of the earth to get them. His incredible power and influence allow him to go as far as he wants. The guy was irritated by the fact that another great creation would become part of the man's collection. All the profits would go to Harry's account, which now belonged to the government, so they could only accept it. Harry heard that all the money would be transferred to his account, and so he sat back, watching with interest as the stakes rose and rose. But then Stephen shouted out his billion-dollar bet. As he walked down the stairs, he asked if everyone had heard. He chuckled and repeated that he was buying it for $1 billion, and then he asked if he should raise the bid to 10 billion.